My name is Kelsey, 33 years old, and I am the founder and CEO of a corporate restructuring firm. I thought my wedding day would be a brief truce in a lifetime of family battles. I was wrong. The champagne was still fizzing in the crystal flutes when my father Howard picked up the microphone. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, filled with 200 of Manhattan's elite, fell completely silent. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the tables adorned with white orchids, but the atmosphere instantly turned freezing cold. I had just finished cutting the 4-tier vanilla wedding cake with Liam, my husband, of exactly 3 hours. We were smiling, posing for the photographer, believing the hardest part of dealing with my parents was over. Howard did not look at me. He looked directly at Liam. Liam is a sharp, high-powered corporate attorney, a man who navigates hostile takeovers and aggressive litigation for a living. But even he was caught off guard by the sheer audacity of what was about to unfold. My father stood at the edge of the dance floor, his posture rigid, his designer tuxedo immaculate. He tapped the side of his champagne glass with a silver spoon. The sharp, high-ringing sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings, commanding the attention of every single guest in the room. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks were set down on porcelain plates. Everyone turned toward the sound, anticipating a heartwarming toast from the father of the bride. Instead, Howard reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. He did not pull out a speech written on a napkin. He pulled out a stiff, cream-colored document. It was printed on heavy cardstock, the kind used for formal legal notices. I could see the embossed logo of his investment company gleaming at the very top. He unfolded the thick paper slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone saw the formal nature of the document he held. He adjusted his reading glasses, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. "You are marrying into a legacy." Liam, my father, began, his voice booming over the sound system. "But legacies come with costs. It is time we settle the accounts." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A judge from the appellate court seated at a table near the front exchanged a horrified look with a senior corporate partner from Liam's law firm. The air in the room grew thick with tension, a heavy, suffocating pressure that pressed down on my chest. I knew my father was prone to grandstanding, prone to making everything about himself and his perceived sacrifices, but this was a new level of public cruelty. He held the document up higher, ensuring the spotlight caught the stark black ink on the cream paper. "Let us begin with item 1, he announced, his tone clinical and detached, as if he were reading a quarterly earnings report to a boardroom of unenthusiastic shareholders. $15,000 for orthodontic work in 2008. I felt the blood drain from my face. He was actually doing this. He was reading an itemized bill of my childhood. Item 2. He continued, his voice steady and unapologetic. $100,000 for basic room board and sustenance over 18 years. He paused, letting the absurdity of charging a child for basic necessities wash over the crowd. A low murmur rippled through the back of the ballroom, a mixture of disbelief and second-hand embarrassment. But Howard was completely immune to the social cues of the room. He thrived on the shock value. Item 3, he declared, raising his voice slightly to drown out the murmurs. $250,000 for what we will categorize as future guidance and family branding. He let the words hang in the heavy air. Future guidance and family branding. The audacity of the phrase was staggering. He was putting a price tag on his toxic control, labeling his psychological manipulation as a premium service he had provided to me. The total, my father announced, looking up from the paper and staring directly into Liam's eyes, comes to a staggering $740,000, payable immediately. The ballroom went dead silent. The silence was absolute, heavy, and paralyzing. No one breathed. No one moved. Even the waitstaff stood frozen against the walls, holding trays of uneaten food. The sheer unadulterated cruelty of presenting a bill for raising a child at her own wedding reception was too massive for anyone to process in real time. My father lowered the paper, a sickeningly smug smirk spreading across his face. He looked at Liam, treating my husband not as a new son-in-law, but as a hostile corporate acquisition. Since you are now officially her husband and a highly compensated attorney, I expect a wire transfer by Monday morning, Howard said. Consider it the cost of acquiring a woman we spent nearly $1 million raising. You need to clear her debt to this family before you start a new one. He walked slowly toward our sweetheart table. Every eye in the room tracked his movement. He reached our table and dropped the invoice directly next to my bridal bouquet of white orchids. The heavy cardstock landed with a soft thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He expected me to shatter. He expected me to lower my head in shame, to apologize for being a burden, to beg Liam to fix this humiliating mess. He wanted to break me in front of the people I respected most, to remind me that no matter how successful my cybersecurity firm became, I would always owe him. I would always be his property. I stared at the cream-colored paper resting against the pristine white petals of my orchids. The black ink seemed to mock me. $740,000. The cost of my existence calculated and weaponized. The room waited for my reaction, bracing for the breakdown. Before the silence could break, my mother, Patricia, stepped out from the shadows near the bandstand. She moved with the practiced elegance of a woman who had spent her entire life studying how to dominate a room. She wore a floor-length silver gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, a dress that looked far more suited for a prestigious charity gala than for her role as the mother of the bride. She placed a meticulously manicured hand on my father's shoulder, a visual display of their united front against me. She did not look at me either. Like my father, she turned her gaze entirely upon Liam. She projected a fake, pitying smile, the kind of smile she usually reserved for service workers who had made a slight error. "Liam, dear, we just want to make sure you truly understand the investment we made," Patricia said. Her voice was smooth and dangerously calm, carrying effortlessly over the microphone. "We will not let you marry a freeloader without understanding her absolute financial obligations. A freeloader. She owes us for the life we generously gave her. This invoice is simply a necessary lesson in accountability." At the head table seated to my left, my younger sister Brittany let out a soft, theatrical sigh. Brittany was the undisputed golden child of the family. She was wearing a stunning, form-fitting white lace dress, a deliberate and aggressive slight against me on my wedding day, which I had forced myself to ignore all evening. Now she leaned back in her chair, crossed her legs, and smirked. She slowly raised her crystal champagne flute in a mocking, silent toast toward me, her eyes dancing with malicious delight. She was thoroughly enjoying the spectacle, relishing the sight of my public humiliation. The tension in the ballroom escalated from suffocating to actively hostile. A low, continuous murmur began to ripple through the crowd of 200 elite guests. I could see the distinct divide in the room's reaction. Some of the older, deeply traditional guests from my parents' country club circle were nodding in solemn agreement, whispering about respect and familial duty. However, the corporate partners and federal judges from Liam's law firm looked visibly disgusted. They were professionals trained to spot extortion, and they were watching it unfold in real time, masked as family tradition. My father, emboldened by my mother's public support and the murmurs of the older guests, leaned closer to the microphone. "The time for games is over," Howard demanded, his tone hardening into an uncompromising command. "You want to prove your worth to this family, Liam. You want to prove you are man enough to take on her burdens. Write the check tonight. Clear her slate. Prove that you are not just another mistake she is making." My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that threatened to deafen me. A freeloader. The word echoed in my mind, a toxic loop designed to crush my spirit. A freeloader. A freeloader. I felt the familiar heavy weight of their psychological conditioning pressing down on my shoulders, attempting to force me into submission. But I was no longer the frightened teenager who shrank under their constant criticism. I took a deep, steadying breath. I smoothed the intricate silk skirt of my wedding dress. I did not rush. I walked slowly and deliberately around the sweetheart table. I approached my father and calmly took the microphone directly from his hand. He released it easily, a smug grin plastered across his face. He expected me to cry. He expected an apology. "A freeloader?" I asked softly. The single word resonated through the massive speakers, cutting through the whispers of the guests like a sharpened blade. I turned to face the vast ballroom, locking eyes with the wealthiest individuals at table 4. "Let us discuss the concept of a freeloader." I pointed to the very first line on his ridiculous invoice, $15,000 for teenage braces. I turned back to Patricia, my expression turning to ice. "Mother, perhaps your selective memory is failing you again. I paid the orthodontist directly. I worked 3 consecutive shifts a week at a greasy diner on 4th Street from the exact moment I turned 16, because you flatly refused to fund a cosmetic flaw." "A freeloader." I repeated the repetition, anchoring my resolve and emphasizing their cruelty. $250,000 for future guidance. I stepped closer to Howard. The smugness vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden sharp panic. "Future guidance?" I asked, my voice rising. "Is that what we call identity theft now?" The entire ballroom gasped in unison. "When I was 18, I continued, my voice unwavering. My father stole my social security number to take out high-interest loans. He needed the cash to cover his massive losses on a failed commercial real estate venture. $250,000 of toxic debt attached to my name before I even attended my first college class. That was your future guidance, Dad." Howard's face turned a mottled, furious purple. "You lying little brat," he hissed, leaning in close, forgetting the microphone in his rage. "I will call the hotel security right now and have you physically thrown out of your own wedding reception for slander." I smiled at him. It was a cold, calculated smile. "Call them," I said. "Please. But before you make that call, Liam has something for the guests." I nodded slightly toward my husband. Liam, radiating absolute calm, unclasped the brushed steel locks of his leather briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of sleek, matte black envelopes. He placed them carefully on the table. "Funny," I said, staring directly into my father's terrified eyes. "I have an invoice too. It is time for the final payment. You demanded accountability from me tonight, and I am simply providing the exact detailed documentation that you requested. The truth is finally going to be fully revealed to everyone." I signaled the catering manager near the kitchen doors. We had rehearsed this moment meticulously during the venue walkthrough. Within seconds, 10 waitstaff members moved swiftly through the grand ballroom. They carried silver trays holding the sleek black envelopes Liam had just placed on the table. They did not distribute them randomly. They moved with absolute precision, targeting specific individuals we identified beforehand. They approached table 4, where my father's wealthiest country club associates sat. They handed envelopes to senior partners at my mother's charity board. They made sure my uncle, the family patriarch who always defended my parents, received one directly in his hands. Howard lunged forward, his face contorted in a mix of rage and sudden terror. He tried to snatch an envelope from a passing waiter, but the young man deftly pivoted out of reach. "What is this?" Howard demanded, his voice cracking as he gripped the edge of our sweetheart table. "What exactly are you handing out to my friends?" I kept my voice perfectly level, projecting absolute authority. "Open them," I instructed the guests, addressing the room. "Please take a moment to look at the real cost of being part of this family. I want you all to see the exact price tag attached to the privilege of sharing my bloodline." The sound of tearing paper filled the quiet ballroom. It was a crisp, sharp noise echoing across the tables. Inside those envelopes were not handwritten invoices scrawled on hotel stationery. They were certified bank statements, highlighted credit reports, and notarized IRS tax transcripts. I had spent months compiling them, working late into the night at my firm, using every forensic accounting tool at my disposal. I turned my attention entirely to Patricia. She was gripping the edge of the head table, her knuckles turning white against the pristine tablecloth. "You stood there and called me a freeloader." "Mother," I said, holding her gaze, "you told Liam I never appreciated your sacrifices. I want you to look at page 3 of the document your friends are currently reading. Those documents show a total of $1.2 million. Patricia gasped, taking a staggering step backward. Her silver gown shimmered under the lights, but all her manufactured elegance had completely evaporated. $1.2 million, I repeated, ensuring the number sank into the minds of everyone listening. That is the exact amount of credit card debt you and Brittany racked up under my name over the past 7 years. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the guests. I saw a prominent venture capitalist at table 4 adjust his glasses, staring intently at the bank statements in his hands. Luxury ski trips to Aspen. I continued walking slowly across the stage. $40,000 in designer handbags for Brittany. Exclusive spa retreats in Switzerland. First-class flights to Paris. You opened those accounts using my personal credentials when I was working 80-hour weeks to build my company from the ground up. You stole my identity to fund a lifestyle you could not afford, and you left me holding the bag. Howard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The physical evidence was literally in the hands of his peers. I paid off that $1.2 million quietly. I told the room, my voice echoing with cold precision. I tracked every IP address, every shipping confirmation, every single fraudulent transaction back to your laptop and mother's phone. I cleared the debt because the alternative was watching my own mother and sister go to federal prison for wire fraud and identity theft. I protected you, and your response is to hand me a bill for braces I paid for myself. The dynamic in the room shattered. The carefully constructed facade of the wealthy, perfect family collapsed into dust. Brittany, cornered by the undeniable physical evidence in the hands of the guests, suddenly snapped. She jumped up from her seat at the head table. Her chair crashed backward onto the polished wooden floor with a violent thud. She grabbed her champagne flute and slammed it down, shattering the crystal into dozens of pieces. "You are a liar!" Brittany screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, echoing painfully in the large space. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her face flushed a blotchy red. "You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of me because Mom and Dad love me more." She scrambled away from the table, attempting to snatch the documents from the hands of an older woman seated nearby. The woman pulled the papers away, looking at my sister with pure revulsion. "It was a temporary family loan," Brittany wailed, weaponizing her tears and playing the victim card she had perfected since childhood. "It was just a loan to help me launch my lifestyle boutique. You have so much money, Kelsey. You should be honored to support your sister. You should be proud to help me. Why do you even care about a few credit cards?" The sheer delusion of her statement hung in the air. A temporary family loan of over $1 million achieved through felony identity theft. The guests stared at her in utter disbelief. The older traditionalists who had nodded in agreement with my father just minutes ago now looked physically sickened by the revelation. Seeing his wife publicly humiliated and losing control of the narrative, Jamal decided to intervene. My brother-in-law shoved his way past the shattered glass and stormed onto the stage. Jamal always portrayed himself as the ultimate success story. He wore a custom-tailored suit and aggressively flashed a heavy gold Rolex whenever he spoke. He marched directly up to me, pointing a finger dangerously close to my face. "You need to shut your mouth right now, Kelsey," he demanded, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into silence. "I am a high-net-worth trader on Wall Street. I know exactly how all these legal things work perfectly well." I looked at Jamal, feeling the adrenaline sing in my veins. This was the moment I had been waiting for. "You are trying to defame my wife and my family," he sneered, his voice booming through the microphone he had snatched from the podium. "I have the capital to bury you and your little firm in litigation until you are completely bankrupt. I will destroy everything you have built, Kelsey." I stood my ground, refusing to let his physical intimidation work. I looked him up and down, taking in the expensive custom suit and the gold Rolex he loved to flaunt. My eyes turned ice cold. "You want to talk about capital, Jamal?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that still carried perfectly across the silent ballroom. "Let us talk about your investors. Let us talk about where your capital actually comes from." I turned toward the audio-visual booth at the back of the room and gave a sharp, deliberate nod to the technician. The romantic wedding slideshow featuring photos of Liam and me instantly vanished from the massive screens flanking the main stage. In its place, a complex web of financial data appeared illuminating the darkened room with stark white and red graphics. There were detailed charts tracking wire transfers, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and a massive network of shell company registrations. Jamal froze mid-sentence. His aggressive posture crumbled instantly, and his hand dropped limply to his side. The color drained from his face as he stared at the 50-foot projection of his own hidden financial records. "This is not a Wall Street portfolio, Jamal," I announced to the room, stepping forward and tapping the screen behind me. "This is a Ponzi scheme, a textbook amateurish Ponzi scheme built on lies and stolen funds." The ballroom erupted into chaos. I raised my voice to cut through the sudden uproar, breaking down the data for everyone in the room. The charts on the screen clearly traced the flow of money directly from Jamal's supposed investment fund into his own personal banking accounts. The graphics showed exactly how he was funding his collection of luxury sports cars and Brittany's lavish shopping sprees, using the deposits of new investors to pay fake dividends to the older ones. I did not stop there. I walked directly toward the edge of the stage, pointing specifically at the wealthy men sitting at table 4. These were Howard's closest friends, his golf buddies, and his most trusted country club associates. "Jamal used your country club connections to lure these exact men into his fraudulent fund, Dad," I declared, making sure every guest heard me. "He used your reputation to steal their hard-earned money. He promised them exclusive returns while funneling their investments directly into his own pockets." The men at table 4 stood up in absolute outrage. Several of them pulled out their cell phones, frantically logging into their banking apps to check their portfolios. A prominent real estate developer slammed his fist on the table, demanding answers. Jamal began to stammer, sweating profusely under the intense glare of the ballroom spotlights. He desperately claimed it was just a temporary market dip, a minor liquidity issue that would be resolved by Monday morning. But the panic in the room was already escalating as millionaires suddenly realized their money was completely gone. In a desperate attempt to save his own reputation, Howard shoved his way past Jamal and stepped in front of the screen. He screamed at me, his face contorted with panic and rage. "Stop this nonsense right now, Kelsey," he ordered, his voice trembling violently. "Jamal just generated a 30% return for the family business last month. He is making us wealthy. You do not know what you are talking about." I laughed coldly. "A 30% return?" I asked, shaking my head. "Dad, he did not generate a return. He just gave you back a fraction of your own money to keep you quiet and compliant." I clicked a button on a small remote, and the screen transitioned to a new set of documents. I pointed to a specific node on the financial diagram. "Look closely at the source of those funds," I instructed the crowd. "That is not market profit. That is the equity from a second illegal mortgage. Dad, you secretly took out a massive loan against the family estate to pump cash into Jamal's failing scheme. You were hoping to generate enough fake profits to cover up your previous financial losses before the Internal Revenue Service audit next week. You are not a victim here, Howard. You are a complicit co-conspirator in federal fraud." Howard's eyes widened in sheer terror as his deepest secret was laid bare before his entire social circle. He desperately tried to regain control, waving his hands frantically at his friends. "The estate is heavily protected by legal trusts," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She cannot prove anything. My assets are untouchable. You are all safe." This triggered my next major reveal. I signaled the technician one more time. A new document appeared on the screens displaying an official deed of assignment. "You are right that the estate was protected, Dad," I explained, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "But your bank realized how toxic that second mortgage was. They quietly auctioned off that distressed debt 6 months ago to clear their own ledgers. And guess who bought it for pennies on the dollar?" I held up a physical copy of the deed for everyone to see. "My corporate restructuring firm purchased that debt through a subsidiary. I now own that mortgage. That means my company is your primary creditor. You and Patricia are essentially squatting in a house that I hold the keys to. You do not have a family estate anymore. You have an eviction notice waiting to happen. The realization of complete financial ruin shattered the family's artificial unity instantly. Patricia, realizing they were completely broke and publicly exposed, turned and violently slapped Jamal across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the ballroom. She screamed at him, blaming him for losing all their money and destroying their social standing. Brittany shrieked, grabbing Patricia's arm to defend Jamal, while simultaneously demanding to know where her trust fund was. The scene devolved into an absolute circus. Howard, losing his mind completely, lunged at me in a physical blind rage. His hands were outstretched, fingers curled like claws. Liam seamlessly stepped between us, moving with terrifying calmness. He caught Howard's wrist, twisting it just enough to halt his momentum and force him backward. Liam warned him quietly but firmly that assaulting a bride in front of federal judges and corporate lawyers would only add severe criminal charges to his impending federal indictment. Pushed to the absolute brink of destruction, Howard resorted to a dirty, scorched earth tactic. He ripped his arm away from Liam and pulled out his cell phone. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure malice. He proudly announced to the entire room that he had used those same fraudulent Social Security connections to name my cybersecurity firm as the primary guarantor for his corporate tax liabilities. If my company goes down for this Ponzi scheme, the IRS will automatically freeze your corporate accounts on Monday morning, he spit venomously. You are going down with us, you little brat. I will destroy everything you built. Howard snatched the $740,000 invoice from the table and shoved it hard against my chest. He told me this was his backup plan all along. He demanded I pay the $740,000 right now, plus an additional $2 million settlement to bail his company out. If I paid, he would sign the release forms to untangle my firm from his mess. If not, the federal government would destroy my life's work. Patricia dropped to her knees, performing a weeping theatrical plea to the surrounding crowd. She is rich, Patricia wailed, pointing at me. She has millions. She can save her own father. Where is her family loyalty? How can she let us burn? The sheer toxicity suffocated the room. The crowd murmured anxiously. Some conservative guests looked at me, expecting me to cave to familial duty. Instead, I looked down at Patricia and slowly repeated her words. Family loyalty, bailouts, settlements. I used the repetition to build immense psychological tension, stretching the silence until it was almost unbearable. I looked at my watch, completely unfazed by the threat of losing my company. You really thought you could outsmart a data privacy expert with a forged guarantor signature? I asked softly. In the distance, the sharp wail of police sirens became audible, cutting through the Manhattan night. The heavy cardstock of the invoice settled against the delicate white petals of my bridal orchids. The sound of it hitting the table felt deafening. For a fraction of a second, the room remained entirely paralyzed. Then the sharp click of high heels echoed across the polished oak floor of the stage. My mother, Patricia, stepped forward. She moved with the fluid, practiced grace of a woman who had spent decades curating her public image. She wore a floor-length silver gown that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. It was a dress designed to demand attention, a garment far more suited to a high-society charity gala than for a mother of the bride trying to celebrate her daughter. But celebration was never the goal tonight. She placed a meticulously manicured hand on my father's shoulder. The gesture was a visual display of absolute unity. They were a united front, standing tall against the daughter they viewed as a rogue asset. Patricia did not look at me. She turned her icy gaze entirely upon Liam. She tilted her head slightly, offering him a perfectly engineered smile. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth. It was a fake, pitying expression she usually reserved for service staff who had made a minor mistake, or socialites she secretly despised. Liam, dear, Patricia began. Her voice projected clearly over the microphone, smooth and dripping with toxic concern. We just want to make sure you truly understand the magnitude of the investment we made. We need you to comprehend the situation you are walking into. She paused, letting the word investment hang in the air. She was speaking about me, her own daughter, reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. We cannot in good conscience let you marry a freeloader. Patricia continued, her tone heavy with manufactured sorrow. We will not allow you to take on this burden without understanding her absolute financial obligations to this family. She owes us for the very life we generously provided. She owes us for the roof over her head, the food she ate, and the status she enjoyed simply by sharing our last name. A freeloader. The word struck me like a physical blow. I felt my hands ball into fists under the table. My mother stood there wrapped in silver silk, publicly branding me a parasite. This was the woman who had charged me rent the exact moment I turned 18. This was the woman who flatly refused to sign my college financial aid forms because it was too inconvenient to locate her tax returns. Now she was holding a microphone at my wedding reception, demanding compensation for simply giving birth to me. This invoice is not a punishment, Patricia said, her voice echoing across the silent tables. It is a necessary lesson in accountability. She needs to understand that nothing in this world is free. The massive sacrifices we made for her must be acknowledged and properly repaid. My eyes darted from my mother to the head table situated to the left of the dance floor. My younger sister Brittany sat there leaning back in her velvet chair. Brittany was the undisputed golden child of the Preston family. She could do no wrong. She had never worked a day in her life, yet she lived in a luxury loft funded entirely by my parents. Tonight, she had chosen to wear a stunning form-fitting white lace gown. It was a blatant, aggressive violation of wedding etiquette. It was a deliberate slight I had forced myself to ignore all evening long. Now Brittany shifted in her seat and crossed her legs. She caught my eye, and a slow, malicious smirk spread across her perfectly contoured face. She reached for her crystal champagne flute. She raised it toward me in a slow, mocking toast. Her eyes danced with absolute delight. She was thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. She relished the sight of my public humiliation. Beside her sat her husband, Jamal. He leaned back, wrapping an arm around Brittany's chair, looking entirely pleased with the ambush my parents had orchestrated. They were reveling in my destruction. The sheer toxicity of the moment finally broke the silence in the room. A low, continuous murmur began to ripple through the crowd of 200 elite guests. The tension was palpable, heavy enough to crush the breath from my lungs. I scanned the room and saw a distinct, terrifying divide in the reactions of the crowd. At table 4, my father's wealthiest country club associates sat in stiff, rigid silence. These were older, deeply traditional men who ruled their own families with iron fists. I saw a retired hedge fund manager nod slowly, his face set in grim agreement. To them, my father was merely asserting his rightful patriarchal dominance. They viewed this horrifying extortion as a harsh but justified demand for respect. They murmured to each other, validating my parents' insane logic. But the reaction at table 2 was entirely different. This table was filled with Liam's colleagues. Sharp, high-powered corporate attorneys, federal judges, and legal scholars. They were professionals trained to spot fraud, coercion, and extortion. I watched a senior partner from Liam's firm drop his napkin, his jaw literally hanging open in disgust. An appellate court judge seated next to him shook her head, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. They were watching a shakedown playing out in high society, and they were thoroughly repulsed. The murmurs grew louder, threatening to turn into a chaotic uproar. The atmosphere shifted from awkward to actively hostile. I felt Liam tense beside me. The warmth of his arm vanished as his muscles locked into stone. He did not say a single word, but his jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He was a man who navigated hostile corporate takeovers for a living, and he instantly recognized the aggression aimed at us. He shifted his weight, preparing to stand and shield me from the assault. I placed my hand firmly on his thigh. I squeezed twice. It was our silent signal, a request to hold his ground. I needed to handle this. My father, sensing the shifting energy in the room, and perhaps fearing losing control of the narrative, snatched the microphone back from Patricia. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He pointed directly at Liam, his face twisting into an ugly, demanding sneer. "The time for games and polite smiles is over," Howard demanded, his voice booming with aggressive authority. You want to prove your worth to this family, Liam. You want to prove you are man enough to take on her burdens and marry a Preston. Then you write the check tonight. You pull out your pen, and you clear her slate. Howard leaned closer to the microphone, his breath loud and harsh over the speakers. $740,000. You wire the money or you write the check right now. Prove that you are not just another mistake she is making. Prove you belong at this table. The tension in the ballroom peaked, snapping like a taut wire. The air crackled with hostility. My father stood on the stage waiting for our surrender. He believed he had cornered us. He believed he had won. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him. I did not back down. I did not flinch under the weight of his furious glare or the hostile murmurs rippling through the older conservative guests. Instead, a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. It was the exact smile of someone who had anticipated this precise confrontation for years. I turned my head slightly and gave Liam a single crisp nod. Liam moved with the fluid grace of a predator closing a trap. He lifted his heavy leather briefcase from the floor and placed it squarely on the pristine white tablecloth right next to my father's absurd printed invoice. The sharp metallic click of the briefcase latches snapping open cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom. Liam reached inside and withdrew a thick stack of sleek matte black envelopes. The stark, dark color was a violent contrast to the delicate silver and white wedding decor. "Funny," I said, projecting my voice so it bounced off the crystal chandeliers and reached every corner of the massive room. "I have an invoice, too." I raised my hand and signaled the catering manager who was hovering anxiously near the kitchen's swinging doors. We had rehearsed this specific choreography extensively during the venue walkthrough. Within seconds, 12 members of the professional waitstaff emerged from the shadows. They moved with absolute military precision, carrying silver serving trays loaded with the black envelopes. They did not distribute them randomly to the crowd. They were given highly specific targets. They marched directly toward Table 4, dropping envelopes into the hands of Howard's most powerful country club friends and his primary business investors. They moved swiftly to the front tables, handing them to the elite members of Patricia's charity board and her tight-knit socialite circle. They handed one to the federal judge. They handed one to the senior partners at Liam's law firm. Howard lunged forward, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. He slammed his hand onto the sweetheart table, knocking over a crystal water goblet. The water spilled across the white linen, soaking into his own fake invoice. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking with sudden terror. "What exactly are you handing out to my business partners, Kelsey?" I kept my posture completely straight, radiating absolute, unshakable authority. I ignored his panicked demands and addressed the room directly. "Open them," I instructed the bewildered guests. "Please take a moment to look at the real cost of being part of this family. I want you all to see the exact price tag attached to the privilege of sharing my bloodline." The sound of tearing heavy paper filled the cavernous room. It was a sharp, aggressive noise echoing across the tables as manicured fingers ripped open the black wax seals. Inside those envelopes were not handwritten lists scrawled on hotel stationery. They were highly sensitive, certified financial documents. They were official bank statements from elite credit institutions and verified Internal Revenue Service tax transcripts. Every single page was highlighted and heavily annotated with forensic accounting precision. I turned my attention entirely to Patricia. She was gripping the edge of the head table, her knuckles turning a sickly shade of white. "You stood there on a microphone and called me a freeloader." "Mother," I said, holding her terrified gaze. "You told my husband I never appreciated your sacrifices. I want you to direct your attention to page 3 of the document your charity board friends are currently reading." Patricia gasped, taking a staggering step backward. Her silver designer gown shimmered under the stage lights, but all her manufactured elegance evaporated in an instant. The polished socialite facade crumbled, revealing the terrified fraud underneath. "Those documents show a total of $1.2 million, I announced, ensuring the massive number sank into the minds of everyone listening. "That is the exact amount of credit card debt you and Brittany racked up under my personal credentials over the past 7 years." A collective shockwave rippled through the guests. I saw a prominent venture capitalist at table 4 adjust his reading glasses, staring intently at the bank statements in his hands, his face draining of color. The older traditionalists who had supported my father moments ago were now reading the transcripts with expressions of deep physical revulsion. Let us talk about your immense sacrifices, mother. I continued, walking slowly across the stage toward her. Luxury ski trips to Aspen funded by a platinum card opened using my social security number. $40,000 in limited edition designer handbags for Brittany shipped directly to her luxury loft in Soho. Exclusive spa retreats in Switzerland. First-class flights to Paris and Milan. I watched Patricia's breathing become shallow and erratic as I listed off her crimes. You opened those fraudulent accounts using my personal identity when I was working 80-hour weeks to build my company from the ground up. I stated, the anger finally bleeding into my voice. You stole my identity to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle you could not afford, and you left me holding the bag. You committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to buy designer shoes and vintage champagne. Howard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The physical evidence was literally in the hands of the men who controlled his business loans. He was publicly ruined, and he knew it. I paid off that $1.2 million entirely on my own, I told the room, my voice echoing with cold, ruthless precision. I run a cybersecurity firm, Mother. My entire professional existence revolves around tracking digital footprints and securing encrypted data. I traced every single IP address used to open those accounts. I tracked every shipping confirmation. I followed the digital trail of every fraudulent transaction directly back to your personal laptop in the den and Brittany's smartphone. Patricia raised a shaking hand to her mouth, letting out a strangled, pathetic sob. The elite socialites she had spent years trying to impress were now looking at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. She was no longer their peer. She was a common thief. I paid the debt quietly, I explained, my eyes locking onto my mother's terrified face, because the absolute only alternative was watching my own mother and my sister go to a federal penitentiary. I protected you. I shielded you from the devastating legal consequences of your own criminal greed. I paid for your Aspen ski trips and your Swiss mud baths while eating instant noodles in a studio apartment, trying to keep my business afloat. And your response, your gratitude, is to ambush me at my wedding reception and hand me a bill for childhood orthodontics. The dynamic in the room completely shattered. The carefully constructed facade of the wealthy, perfect Preston family collapsed into dust right in front of Manhattan's elite. The silence was no longer tense. It was the silence of absolute judgment. I did not just pay it off and forget it. I added, lowering my voice to a dangerous hum that commanded total silence. I secured every single piece of digital evidence. I built an ironclad legal case against both of you over the last 7 years. I have the MAC addresses, the login timestamps, the delivery signatures, and the recorded phone calls to the credit card companies where you blatantly impersonated me. I possess a mountain of forensic data that federal prosecutors dream about finding. I hold your entire future in my hands. The sharp wail of police sirens grew louder, echoing off the Manhattan skyscrapers and bleeding into the silent ballroom. Howard remained frozen with his arm outstretched, the fraudulent invoice trembling in his hand. He thought the sirens were for him. He thought his corporate tax fraud was the final act of this tragedy. He was wrong. The corporate fraud was merely the prologue. The true betrayal, the deeply personal violation, was still waiting to be unmasked. I stepped past Howard, entirely dismissing his presence, and stopped directly in front of Patricia. She was still kneeling on the floor, performing her theatrical weeping. I looked down at her. "Get up, Patricia," I commanded, my voice echoing through the microphone. "Get up and face the reality you created." I turned to Liam. He stepped forward carrying a thick stack of heavy manila envelopes. He moved with absolute precision, handing them to the judges, the corporate lawyers, and the wealthy socialites at the front tables. "Open them," I instructed the room. "Open the envelopes and see the true cost of being a member of this family." The sound of tearing paper filled the ballroom. It was a harsh, grating noise that cut through the underlying tension. Dozens of guests pulled out thick stacks of documents. They were not corporate ledgers. They were highly sensitive personal financial records. They were certified bank statements. They were official Internal Revenue Service tax transcripts. Every single page was highlighted, annotated, and stamped with forensic verification codes. I kept my eyes locked on Patricia. Her theatrical tears vanished, replaced by a look of stark, unadulterated terror. She recognized the logo of the banking institution on the top page. She knew exactly what those documents contained. "You lectured me about family loyalty, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, steady rhythm. "You stood there and demanded to know how I could let my family burn. So let us talk about loyalty. Let us talk about family. Let us talk about identity." I pointed to the documents in the hands of the federal judge seated at table 2. "Look at the statements," I told the crowd. "Look at the name on those accounts. Look at the signature on those credit applications." The judge adjusted his glasses, his face paling as he read the highlighted sections. "It is your name," he whispered, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "Kelsey Preston." "Yes," I replied. "It is my name, my social security number, my flawless credit history." But I did not authorize a single one of those transactions. I stepped closer to Patricia, forcing her to look at me. "You stole my name," I said. "You stole my credit. You stole my identity." For 7 years, Patricia and Brittany operated a sophisticated identity theft ring inside our own home. I projected my voice, ensuring every single guest heard the absolute truth. They opened 6 different platinum credit lines using my personal credentials. They forged my signature. They bypassed security protocols using my childhood verification answers. My mother used her intimate knowledge of my life to answer security questions about my first pet, my elementary school, and my maternal grandmother. She weaponized my childhood against me. They racked up $1.2 million in consumer debt. $1.2 million. The ballroom erupted in a collective gasp of revulsion. The wealthy socialites who had previously humored Patricia were now looking at her with pure disgust. A prominent philanthropist at the front table dropped the documents onto her plate as if they were physically contaminated. Brittany, who was standing near the head table, suddenly shrank back, trying to hide behind a floral arrangement. $1.2 million. I repeated the number, letting it sink into the minds of everyone present. $1.2 million spent on luxury. $1.2 million spent on vanity. $1.2 million spent on destroying my future to fund their present. I turned to the screens behind the stage. I signaled the audiovisual technician. The financial diagrams vanished, replaced by a rapid succession of photographic evidence. There was Patricia sipping champagne in a private chalet in Aspen. There was Brittany posing with a limited edition Birkin bag on the streets of Milan. There they were laughing at exclusive spa retreats in Switzerland. Every luxury Aspen ski trip I listed pacing the length of the stage, every designer handbag collection, every first-class flight to Europe, every 5-star hotel suite, every single indulgence was funded by stolen money. You lived like billionaires on the back of my stolen identity. You paraded your wealth to this entire room while quietly bankrupting your own daughter. You smiled in my face while you systematically destroyed my credit score. Patricia's face was completely drained of color. She was trembling violently, shaking her head in silent denial. "It was a mistake," she choked out, her voice barely audible over the hum of the shocked crowd. "We were going to pay it back. It was just a temporary solution." A temporary solution. I echoed the repetition, driving the absurdity of her excuse into the ground. A 7-year-long temporary solution that resulted in over $1 million of default debt. A temporary solution that triggered a massive federal investigation. A temporary solution that nearly sent me to a federal penitentiary. I stopped pacing. I stood absolutely still, radiating a dangerous, quiet calm. When the Internal Revenue Service and the credit bureaus flagged the massive defaults, they did not come looking for Patricia or Brittany, I explained to the horrified guests. They came looking for me. They came looking for the CEO of a cybersecurity firm with over $1 million in unexplained fraudulent debt. The IRS placed liens on my accounts. The federal investigators prepared warrants. You almost destroyed my company. You almost destroyed my freedom. You almost put me behind bars for crimes I did not commit. I looked at Brittany, who was now weeping silently, mascara running down her cheeks. You really thought you could commit digital fraud against a cybersecurity expert, I asked her. You thought you could hide behind encrypted networks and fake IP addresses. I tapped my temple. I track hackers for a living, Brittany. I dismantle international cyber syndicates. I pulled the network logs from our family estate. I traced every single IP address used to open those accounts. I tracked the MAC addresses of the devices used to authorize the wire transfers. I cross-referenced the location data from your social media posts with the exact timestamps of the fraudulent purchases. I built a comprehensive, airtight digital map of your entire criminal enterprise. I turned back to Patricia. I paid it off. I stated the truth, dropping like a lead weight. I quietly liquidated my personal stock options, and I paid off the entire $1.2 million balance out of my own pocket. I absorbed the massive financial hit because it was the absolute only way to stop the federal indictments from moving forward immediately against me. I paid the debt to buy myself time. I bought time to completely isolate my corporate assets from your toxic fraud. I bought time to build an ironclad, indisputable legal case against both of you. The sirens outside were deafening now, directly in front of the venue. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the frosted windows of the ballroom, casting erratic shadows across the walls. You thought I was a quiet, compliant victim? I said, my voice steady and resolute over the approaching chaos. You thought I was weak. You thought my silence was submission. My silence was strategy. Every day you flaunted your stolen wealth, I was gathering evidence. Every time you mocked my work ethic, I was securing the trap. Every single transaction you made was a nail in your own coffin. I looked at the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom just as they swung open. Uniformed officers and plainclothes detectives stepped into the room, their badges catching the chandelier light. You wanted me to pay for the privilege of being in this family, I whispered, my eyes locked on Patricia's terrified face. Consider the debt paid in full. The officers paused just inside the entrance, taking in the sheer chaos of the ballroom. Before they could even cross the floor to detain Patricia, another figure inserted himself into the crossfire. Seeing his wife Brittany publicly humiliated and his mother-in-law weeping on the floor, Jamal snapped. He shoved his chair back so violently it crashed into the table behind him. He stormed up the steps of the main stage, his heavy footsteps echoing through the silent room. He marched directly toward me, inserting his large frame between me and Patricia. Jamal raised his hand and pointed a thick finger aggressively inches from my face. As he did, the sleeve of his custom-tailored tuxedo pulled back deliberately, exposing the massive diamond-encrusted Rolex glittering on his wrist. It was his signature move, a physical flex of wealth designed to intimidate anyone he considered beneath him. "You are out of your mind, Kelsey," he snarled, his voice projecting across the room. He snatched the microphone from my father's limp hand. "I am a high-net-worth Wall Street trader, and I will absolutely not stand here and allow you to defame my family with forged documents and cheap digital tricks. You think you can humiliate my wife in front of Manhattan's elite and get away with it?" I did not step back. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I looked at the heavy gold watch ticking on his wrist, and then slowly raised my eyes to meet his furious glare. "I am going to ruin you!" Jamal bellowed, the veins in his neck standing out. "I am going to hit you with a defamation lawsuit so massive it will completely vaporize whatever pathetic little cybersecurity firm you think you run. I have the capital to bury you in litigation for the next 10 years. I will bankrupt you, Kelsey. I will leave you with absolutely nothing." He stood there, chest heaving, waiting for me to cower. He genuinely believed his Wall Street persona made him untouchable. He believed his aggressive posturing would silence me the way it always silenced my parents. He was severely mistaken. My eyes turned ice cold. I looked past his pointing finger and met his gaze with absolute terrifying calm. "You want to talk about capital, Jamal?" I asked. my voice dropping to a sharp, dangerous whisper that carried perfectly through the speakers. Let us talk about your investors. Let us talk about your capital. Let us talk about where your money actually comes from. Jamal scoffed, letting out a harsh, dismissive laugh. My investors are some of the wealthiest individuals on the eastern seaboard, he bragged, panning his gaze across the room, specifically landing on my father's country club associates at table 4. They trust me because I deliver results, something you know nothing about. I did not argue with him. I simply turned my head toward the elevated audio-visual booth at the back of the ballroom. I caught the eye of the head technician and gave him a single sharp nod. Instantly, the massive dual projection screens flanking the stage flickered. The romantic wedding slideshow featuring soft focus photos of Liam and me completely vanished. The ballroom was suddenly plunged into a stark, harsh white light. The screens filled with a complex, sprawling web of digital financial data. Jamal froze. The aggressive sneer melted off his face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated panic. Red and blue lines darted across the 50-foot screens connecting massive blocks of text. The entire ballroom stared in stunned silence at a highly detailed digital map of international wire transfers, offshore banking accounts in the Cayman Islands, and a massive labyrinth of shell company registrations. I stepped forward and tapped the screen directly behind me. I am breaking down the data for the room, I announced, projecting my voice so every single guest could hear the undeniable truth. Jamal is not a Wall Street prodigy. Jamal is not a financial genius. Jamal is not an investment guru. He is running a textbook, blatant Ponzi scheme. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked gasps and angry murmurs. Jamal lunged for the microphone, trying to rip it from my hands, but Liam stepped in seamlessly, blocking his path and forcing him back with a silent, menacing glare. Look at the charts, I commanded the audience, pointing to the massive red arrows flowing across the digital projection. These transactions trace the flow of money directly from Jamal's supposed hedge fund straight into his own personal checking accounts. He is not investing your money in the market. He is not generating wealth for your portfolios. He is using the deposits of new investors to pay fake dividends to the older ones. I clicked a button on a small remote in my hand. The screen zoomed in on a highly specific set of bank transfers. This is where your capital actually goes, I declared. It goes to fund his fleet of luxury sports cars. It goes to pay for Brittany's lavish shopping sprees in Paris. It goes to purchase the diamond-encrusted Rolex he was just waving in my face a few moments ago. He is stealing your hard-earned wealth to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle. I turned my attention directly to the wealthy men sitting at table 4. These were Howard's closest friends and the very men Jamal had targeted. Jamal used my father's country club connections to lure you into this fraudulent fund, I revealed, making sure they understood the depth of the betrayal. He used the Preston family reputation to gain your trust. He used our private dinners to pitch his lies. He used your friendship with my father to drain your portfolios. Every single quarterly statement he sent you was completely fabricated. Your money is gone. Your investments are gone. Your capital is gone. The men at table 4 erupted. A prominent real estate developer slammed his fist onto the table, shattering a water glass. Several of them pulled out their smartphones, frantically trying to log into their investment portals. The realization of complete financial ruin hit them like a freight train. They began shouting, demanding answers from Jamal, who was now sweating profusely under the harsh stage lights. Howard watched in absolute horror as the men he golfed with, the men he vacationed with, the men he depended on for social survival turned their vicious anger toward him. "Howard, you vouched for this criminal!" The real estate developer roared across the room, his face purple with rage. "You brought him into our homes, Howard. You sat at my dining table and promised me this fund was bulletproof." Howard shrank back, raising his hands defensively. "I did not know," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "I swear to you I did not know. He lied to me too. He took my money too." But there was no sympathy for Howard. Not tonight. Not ever again. He had enabled a monster, and now the monster was dragging him down into the abyss. I watched my father crumble under the weight of his own terrible choices. I watched the elite social circle he prized above his own daughter completely excommunicate him in real time. It was a brutal, comprehensive dismantling of a corrupt dynasty. "It is a lie," Jamal stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. He was backing away from the edge of the stage, desperate to escape the furious glares of the men he had robbed. "It is just a temporary liquidity issue. The market took a downturn. She is manipulating the data." "There is no market downturn, Jamal," I countered coldly. "You never put their money in the market. You transferred $2 million last Tuesday to a shell corporation in the Bahamas, registered under Brittany's maiden name. The IRS forensic unit has already seized those offshore accounts." Hearing the mention of the IRS, the federal officers who had been waiting by the doors finally moved forward. They marched down the center aisle of the ballroom, their expressions grim and professional. Jamal saw them coming and physically stumbled backward, tripping over a microphone cord. He hit the stage floor hard, scrambling away like a cornered animal. Jamal continued to thrash against the floor. "Do you know who I am?" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "I am a titan. I run markets. You cannot arrest me on the word of a bitter little tech girl." The lead detective did not even blink. "You have the right to remain silent," the detective stated in a flat, bored tone. "I highly suggest you start using it." Brittany shrieked, running to her husband's side. She grabbed his arm, trying to pull him up while screaming at the approaching detectives. "You cannot touch him," she wailed hysterically. "We are rich. We are untouchable. You are all just jealous of our success." Her delusion was absolutely repulsive. The guests watched in horrific fascination as the golden couple of the Preston family was exposed as nothing more than common thieves. The federal detectives stepped onto the stage, ignoring Brittany's frantic screaming. They hauled Jamal to his feet, pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed perfectly through the microphone I still held in my hand. In the distance, the sharp wail of police sirens became audible, cutting through the Manhattan night. The sirens acted as a massive acoustic trigger, snapping the paralyzed room out of its shock. The wealthy men at Table 4 did not just stand up, they erupted. These were men who controlled vast corporate empires, who measured their personal worth in quarterly profits and offshore dividends. Seeing the undeniable digital proof that their portfolios had been drained by an amateur con artist ignited a primal, aggressive fury. A billionaire real estate developer knocked his heavy mahogany chair backward, sending it crashing to the floor. He marched directly toward the stage, his face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. He bypassed me entirely and pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my father. "Howard, you vouched for this criminal!" The developer roared, his voice echoing violently across the ballroom. "You brought him into our exclusive club. You sat at my private dining table, drank my vintage scotch, and personally guaranteed this fund was bulletproof. You used our 30-year friendship to feed my retirement into a meat grinder." Jamal was sweating so profusely his custom-tailored collar was soaked through. His previously arrogant posture collapsed into a pathetic defensive crouch. He frantically backed away from the edge of the stage, his eyes darting toward the heavy velvet curtains covering the service exits. "It is a misunderstanding," he stammered, holding his hands up as if to physically ward off the angry millionaires. "The assets are just temporarily frozen. It is a minor market dip. I just need 48 hours to shift the capital and restore the liquidity." "There is no capital, Jamal," I interjected, my voice cutting through the shouting with icy forensic precision. "There is no market dip, and there is no liquidity. You cannot shift money that no longer exists. You spent their corporate investments on Brittany's diamond tennis bracelets and your private jet rentals. The federal authorities have already seized your shell companies in the Caymans. Your entire financial network has been neutralized." The realization that millions of dollars were gone permanently hit the guests like a physical shockwave. Before the angry investors could physically drag Jamal off the stage, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom violently burst open. The elegant silver and white decor of my wedding reception was suddenly bathed in the harsh, spinning red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked outside. A dozen uniformed officers and stern plainclothes federal agents flooded into the room. Their heavy tactical boots thudded against the polished dance floor, a stark, violent contrast to the delicate crystal and silk surrounding them. "Nobody move," a senior detective commanded, holding up his federal badge. The entire ballroom froze. The angry millionaires released their aggressive stances and stepped back, recognizing the absolute authority of the raid. The detective scanned the room, his eyes locking instantly onto the stage. "Jamal Blackwood," he barked. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of wire fraud securities, fraud, and international money laundering." Jamal let out a strangled, pathetic sound of pure panic. He turned and bolted toward the kitchen, swinging doors, completely abandoning his wife, abandoning his arrogant pride, and abandoning any shred of human dignity. He did not make it 5 steps. 2 large tactical officers tackled him to the floor. The sound of Jamal hitting the hardwood was loud and final. They wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the silent room. Brittany unleashed an ear-piercing, hysterical shriek. She threw herself off the stage, tearing the delicate hem of her highly inappropriate white lace gown. "Jamal," she wailed, dropping to her knees beside him on the hard floor. "Get your hands off him. We are wealthy. You cannot treat us like criminals. We know the mayor. We have powerful lawyers." The detective looked down at her with absolute, unwavering disgust. "Not anymore, ma'am," he said coldly, making sure his restraints were secure. "Your domestic and international assets were frozen by a federal judge at exactly 4 p.m. today. Your accounts are at 0. Brittany stared at the detective, her mouth hanging open. The reality of her situation finally breached her manufactured delusion. Her luxury loft, her designer clothes, her endless European shopping sprees, they were all instantly gone. Patricia, who was still backed against the head table clutching her chest, looked desperately toward her elite socialite friends at the front tables. She was silently begging for an intervention, for someone to validate her status and save her from this public execution. But the women she had spent decades trying to impress simply turned their backs. They gathered their expensive silk wraps and designer clutches, refusing to make eye contact with a woman whose family was currently being hauled away in handcuffs. The social exile was immediate and absolute. Howard slumped against the podium, a broken, defeated man. He looked at the fake $740,000 invoice lying useless on the floor. His artificial empire, built on lies, manipulation, and the financial exploitation of his own daughter, had completely collapsed. The federal agents hauled Jamal to his feet and began marching him down the center aisle of the ballroom, right past our towering, untouched wedding cake. Liam stepped forward and wrapped his arms securely around my waist. He pulled me close, grounding me in his quiet, unshakable strength. We stood together on the stage, watching the toxic remnants of my family face the devastating consequences of their own boundless greed. I turned to the remaining bewildered guests, holding the microphone one last time. "The truth is often ugly," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "But it is always absolutely necessary. I refuse to carry the weight of their lies any longer. I refuse to be the financial scapegoat for their failures. This family built a legacy on deception, and tonight that legacy permanently ends." I placed the microphone gently on the table. The sharp feedback whined for a second before fading into silence. I looked up at Liam, meeting his proud, loving gaze. The war was over. The extortion was finished. The invisible chains they had wrapped around my life were permanently shattered. We turned our backs on the chaos, stepped down from the stage, and walked out of the ballroom hand in hand, ready to begin our actual life together. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed perfectly through the microphone I still held in my hand. Howard staggered back against the edge of the stage as the federal agents hauled his son-in-law away. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs seemed to snap something deep inside his mind. Howard Preston, a man who had spent his entire life bullying subordinates and intimidating his family, suddenly realized he was about to lose the only thing he truly cared about: his reputation. He looked at the furious men at table 4, the elite investors who were currently demanding blood, and his survival instincts kicked into overdrive. He refused to be the fool. He refused to go down with a sinking ship. He straightened his ruined tuxedo jacket and wiped the sweat from his forehead. A manic, desperate spark ignited in his eyes. He actually believed he still held a winning hand. He stepped directly into my line of sight, blocking the federal agents from the crowd. "You are out of your mind, Kelsey," he bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You are making a colossal mistake. You are acting on fabricated evidence manufactured by your own bitter jealousy." He spun around to face table 4, throwing his arms out wide and adopting the booming, authoritative tone he used in corporate board meetings. "Gentlemen, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice echoing across the ballroom. "Do not listen to this hysterical girl. Jamal is a financial prodigy. He is a genius. This fund is not a scam, and your money is completely safe." The wealthy men at the table glared at him, their faces tight with rage. Howard pushed forward desperately, trying to sell his lie. Just last month, Jamal generated a massive 30% return for the family business portfolio. He screamed, pounding his fist against a nearby table for emphasis. 30% in a down market. She is lying to you because she is jealous of her sister's wealth, and she is trying to destroy our corporate credibility. I have the bank statements to prove the returns. Jamal made us millions just 4 weeks ago. The angry executives hesitated. A 30% return was an intoxicating number. They looked from Howard to the handcuffed Jamal and then finally up to me. Doubt flickered in their eyes. Howard was banking on their greed to override their logic. He was throwing a final desperate smoke bomb, hoping to confuse the room long enough to cover his tracks. I did not shout. I did not raise my voice. I simply brought the microphone back to my lips and let out a single cold laugh. It was a sharp, humorless sound that cut through Howard's bluster like a physical blade. A 30% return. I echoed, the amusement completely draining from my voice, leaving behind only a lethal calm. "Is that what we are calling it, Howard? A return on investment?" I turned my head toward the audio-visual booth. I did not even need to give a verbal command. The technician was waiting for his cue. The massive projection screens behind me flickered again. The intricate red and blue web of Jamal's offshore accounts vanished. In its place, a stark black and white document appeared. It was 50 feet tall, perfectly illuminated, and impossible to ignore. "Let us take a very close look at that miraculous 30% return," I instructed the room. Howard turned to look at the screen. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His jaw dropped, but no sound came out. "What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is not a hedge fund dividend," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "What you are looking at is a property deed and a loan origination contract. Specifically, it is the deed to the Preston family estate in Southampton." Patricia let out a sharp gasp, clutching her chest. She stumbled forward, her eyes wide with mounting horror as she read the massive text projected on the screen. "Look at the date on that document," I commanded, pointing to the highlighted section at the top of the screen. "This loan was finalized exactly 3 days before the so-called 30% return magically appeared in the corporate accounts. And look at the amount. It matches your miraculous dividend down to the absolute exact penny." The ballroom was dead silent. The federal agents holding Jamal stopped moving entirely, their eyes fixed on the screen. "You did not receive a return on your investment, Howard," I stated, stepping down from the stage and walking slowly toward him. "You secretly took out a second highly illegal mortgage on the family estate. You bypassed the corporate board. You forged the necessary partner signatures. You leveraged the absolute last unencumbered asset your family possessed to secure a massive influx of raw cash." Howard was shaking his head, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, you do not understand." "I understand perfectly," I replied, closing the distance between us. "I understand that you are not just a gullible victim in Jamal's little Ponzi scheme. You are a complicit co-conspirator." I turned to the federal agents, making sure they heard every single word. "My father was not fooled by his son-in-law," I explained. "Howard discovered the gaping hole in Jamal's fund 2 months ago when the Internal Revenue Service sent a preliminary audit notice to Preston Manufacturing. He realized Jamal had gambled away the corporate reserves. He realized that when the federal audit hit, the missing millions would lead directly to him. I locked eyes with Howard, watching him sweat under the crushing weight of the truth. "So instead of reporting the fraud, you tried to cover it up?" I said, my voice laced with pure disgust. "You illegally mortgaged the house to pump cash directly into Jamal's failing scheme. You were trying to plug the hole before the federal auditors arrived. You robbed Peter to pay Paul in a desperate bid to save your own miserable reputation." Howard staggered backward, but then a twisted, arrogant smile touched his lips. He straightened his shoulders, clinging to a false sense of superiority. "You think you are so smart, Kelsey." He sneered, his voice regaining a fraction of its old arrogance. "You think a flashy presentation means anything. That house is untouchable. The Southampton estate is locked inside an irrevocable multi-generational family trust. I set it up decades ago. It is wrapped in legal armor that no bank, and certainly no bitter little girl, can ever pierce. You cannot prove I forged those signatures, and the bank cannot foreclose on an asset protected by that specific trust structure. We are completely bulletproof." I stood on the floor and simply stared at him. I let his desperate declaration echo through the silent ballroom. I let him bask in his false sense of security for 5 agonizing seconds. "You are living in the 1980s, Howard," I said, stepping closer. "You think modern banking operates on gentlemen's agreements and dusty trust documents. Let me educate you on what happens when a commercial lender realizes they have been conned." I gestured to Liam. He reached into his leather briefcase one final time. He did not pull out a stack of envelopes. He pulled out a single thick document bound in a heavy blue legal folder with a raised gold seal. He handed it to me. "When you stopped making payments on that illegal second mortgage 3 months into Jamal's failing scheme, your bank panicked," I explained, projecting my voice. "Commercial lenders absolutely despise toxic, distressed debt. They do not want a fraudulent multi-million-dollar loan sitting on their books while the IRS circles the waters. They do not want to fight a messy, drawn-out legal battle over an irrevocable trust." I held up the blue folder. "So they did what banks always do with toxic assets," I continued. "They bundled it up and they quietly auctioned it off to the secondary market. They sold your highly distressed, fraudulent mortgage to a private equity and corporate restructuring firm. They sold it for pennies on the dollar, just to scrub their ledgers clean." Howard's face twitched. The manic spark in his eyes flickered and died. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. "And guess who bought it?" I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper that reverberated through the speakers. "Guess who specializes in acquiring distressed, toxic assets from incompetent executives?" I opened the blue folder and held the crisp, heavy paper up to the light. "This is a deed of assignment," I announced. "It is fully executed, legally binding, and registered with the county clerk. My corporate restructuring firm purchased your debt, Howard. We bought the note in its entirety exactly 6 months ago. I am the bank now." Howard's mouth opened, but he could not draw enough air into his lungs to speak. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and realized there was no ground beneath him. "As for your precious, irrevocable trust," I continued, flipping to the second page of the document, "I have some terrible news for you. Because you committed felony fraud to secure the loan, because you forged Patricia's signature and the signatures of the trust executors, you triggered a standard breach of contract clause. Your own criminal actions completely voided the trust protections. The house is absolute fair game. And since you have been in default for over 120 days, I have already initiated the foreclosure proceedings." Patricia let out a guttural, devastating wail. She scrambled up from the floor, clutching the edge of the table. "You cannot take Southampton!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "That is my home. That is my family legacy. You cannot take it from me." "It is no longer your home, Patricia," I stated, looking her dead in the eye. "You are currently squatting in a house that I hold the keys to. I own the mortgage. I am your primary creditor. I own the walls, the floors, the manicured gardens, and the private beach access you love to brag about to your country club friends." Patricia stared at me, the reality of my words crashing through her carefully constructed reality. The Southampton estate was her crown jewel. It was her leverage, her social currency, the very foundation of her identity. knowing that I, the daughter she had deemed worthless, now held the deed to her entire existence, short-circuited her brain. Her mouth opened in a silent scream before her gaze slowly tracked sideways, landing directly on Jamal. The federal agents were still securing Jamal's cuffs, preparing to march him out, but Patricia moved faster than any of them anticipated. She threw herself across the short distance separating them. Her hand lashed out in a vicious arc. The sharp, explosive crack of her palm striking Jamal's cheek echoed like a gunshot through the ballroom. "You parasite!" she shrieked, her voice unrecognizable, stripped of all its polished society inflection. "You absolute worthless parasite! You lost our money. You lost my house. You dragged my family into your gutter." Jamal stumbled backward, his handcuffed arms useless to defend himself. The side of his face was already turning a violent shade of crimson. He bared his teeth, looking less like a Wall Street prodigy and more like a cornered rat. "You gave me the money, Patricia," he spat back, spit flying from his lips. "You and Howard handed it over because you were too greedy to ask questions. You wanted the 30% returns to pay for your own fraudulent credit cards. Do not play the victim now." Brittany let out a deafening, hysterical shriek. She lunged forward, grabbing her mother's arm and yanking her away from Jamal. "Do not touch him!" she screamed, her face streaked with ruined mascara and sweat. "Leave him alone. He is my husband. He is going to fix this. It is a misunderstanding." Patricia ripped her arm out of Brittany's grasp with such force that Brittany stumbled. "Fix it!" Patricia bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at the massive projection screen that still displayed the devastating financial truth. "How is he going to fix this, Brittany? He is wearing federal handcuffs. He transferred our entire net worth to offshore accounts that just got seized by the government. Your husband is a criminal." Brittany froze. Her eyes darted from the red and blue flashing lights outside the windows to the grim faces of the detectives, and finally to the massive digital evidence illuminated behind me. The heavy, suffocating blanket of denial finally began to lift, replaced by a raw, selfish panic. She turned slowly to Jamal, her hands gripping the shredded lace of her designer gown. "Jamal," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Jamal, what about my trust fund? What about the $2 million Dad transferred to you last week?" Jamal refused to look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, his jaw tight. "Look at me!" Brittany demanded, her voice escalating into a frantic screech. "Where is my trust fund, Jamal? We need that money to pay for the loft. We need it for the Paris trip. Where is it?" "It is gone, Brittany," I interjected, my voice cutting through their pathetic domestic dispute with absolute, unyielding clarity. "He used your trust fund to pay off the early investors who were threatening to go to the SEC. He burned your entire future to buy himself exactly 7 days of freedom. You are penniless." Brittany's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the stage floor, sobbing uncontrollably, mourning the loss of her wealth far more than the loss of her husband's freedom. Howard had been standing by the podium watching his legacy, his marriage, and his favored daughter disintegrate in real time. The sight of his empire in ashes, orchestrated by the child he had dismissed and abused for decades, broke whatever fragile tether to sanity he had left. A guttural, animalistic roar tore from his throat. He snapped. Howard Preston, the polished, sophisticated CEO, vanished, replaced by a man consumed by blind physical rage. He lunged directly at me, his hands hooked into claws, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You did this!" he screamed, charging across the stage. "You ungrateful, malicious little freak!" He never finished the sentence. He never even got within 3 feet of me. Liam moved with a fluid, terrifying speed that completely defied his relaxed posture. He did not shout. He did not break a sweat. He simply stepped seamlessly between Howard and me, a solid, immovable wall of tailored wool and pure muscle. As Howard's hands reached for my throat, Liam's hand shot out like a viper. Liam caught Howard's right wrist in midair. The impact made a dull, heavy thud. Howard's forward momentum was brought to a violent, immediate halt. The older man gasped, his eyes widening in shock as Liam's grip tightened around his bones like a steel vice. "I would strongly suggest you reconsider your next movement," Howard Liam said. His voice was incredibly calm, a smooth, dark hum that radiated absolute danger. It was the voice of a man who fought in corporate courtrooms, but knew exactly how to dismantle a physical threat. Howard struggled, gritting his teeth, trying desperately to yank his arm free. "Let go of me," he snarled, his face inches from Liam's. "She ruined my family. She deserves everything coming to her." Liam's grip tightened just a fraction of an inch. Howard let out a sharp hiss of pain, his knees buckling slightly under the intense pressure. "If you take one more aggressive breath in my wife's direction," Liam said, his gaze drilling into Howard's terrified eyes, "I will snap your wrist like a dry twig. And then I will personally ensure that the federal prosecutor adds a felony assault charge to the mountain of corporate fraud indictments currently waiting for you. Do you understand me?" Howard stopped struggling. The fight completely drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell. He looked at Liam, then looked past him to meet my eyes. He saw no pity. He saw no hesitation. He saw only the cold, hard reflection of his own destruction. I said, "Do you understand me?" Liam repeated, his voice dropping an octave, demanding total compliance. "Yes." Howard choked out the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. Liam shoved Howard's arm away with a look of utter disdain. Howard stumbled backward, nearly falling off the edge of the stage before catching himself on a floral pedestal. He stood there, rubbing his bruised wrist, breathing heavily, completely neutralized. The federal agents who had paused to watch the altercation finally stepped in. They flanked Jamal, taking him by the arms. "Let us go," a detective ordered, pushing the disgraced traitor forward. The ballroom watched in deafening silence as Jamal Blackwood was marched down the center aisle. The wealthy investors he had defrauded did not hurl insults as he passed. They simply stared at him with cold, calculating eyes, already mentally preparing their own lawsuits to salvage whatever crumbs were left. Brittany remained on the floor, weeping hysterically, making no effort to follow her husband out the door. Patricia was backed against the wall, hyperventilating, staring blankly at the massive projection screen that declared her a squatter in her own home. The circus had peaked. The grand illusion of the Preston family superiority had been violently shattered, the pieces scattered across the polished dance floor for all of Manhattan's elite to see. The ballroom air was thick with the suffocating silence of a shattered dynasty. The few remaining federal agents began clearing the room, guiding the bewildered and angry guests toward the velvet-draped exits. Patricia remained frozen against the wall, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as she stared at the projection screen that declared her a squatter. Brittany was still a sobbing heap on the floor, mourning her vanished trust fund. But Howard Preston did not stay broken for long. A man who had spent 4 decades twisting the law to serve his own relentless greed always had a contingency plan. As Liam released his iron grip and stepped back to my side, Howard rubbed his bruised wrist. He lowered his head and let out a low, raspy chuckle. It sounded like grinding glass. The sound was so jarringly out of place amidst the absolute ruin of his life that Patricia stopped her hysterical weeping to stare at him in sheer terror. Howard slowly straightened his ruined tuxedo jacket. The panic that had consumed him just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, malicious calm. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his smartphone. His hands were no longer shaking. He tapped the screen a few times, bringing up a digital document. He looked up and locked eyes with me, his gaze filled with pure, unadulterated venom. "You think you won," he said, his voice echoing sharply across the empty dance floor. "You think you can just buy my debt, humiliate me in front of my peers, and walk out of here untouched. You think you are the smartest person in the room, Kelsey." I stood my ground, refusing to let him see even a flicker of hesitation. "You have nothing left to leverage, Howard," I replied coldly. "Your company is bankrupt. Your son-in-law is in federal custody. Your house belongs to my firm. The game is over." Howard smiled, a sickening twisting of his lips that made my stomach churn. "You always were too arrogant for your own good," he sneered. "You underestimated how far I am willing to go to protect my interests. You backed a desperate man into a corner and forgot that I know exactly how to fight dirty." He turned his phone around, holding the screen up for me to see. The text was too small to read the fine print from a distance, but the heavy official seal of the Internal Revenue Service was clearly visible at the top of the PDF document. When the preliminary audit notice arrived 2 months ago, I knew the situation was dire. Howard explained, his tone dripping with arrogant satisfaction. Jamal's spectacular incompetence had exposed Preston Manufacturing to massive corporate tax liabilities. We owed millions in back taxes, fines, and federal penalties. The IRS was threatening to lock our accounts immediately. I needed a guarantor. I needed an external corporate entity with spotless credit, flawless financial records, and massive liquid assets to secure a stay of execution from the federal government. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, relishing the trap he was springing. I needed an ironclad guarantee to keep the auditors at bay while Jamal tried to recover the funds. So I gave them your cybersecurity firm. The words hit me like a physical blow. The absolute sociopathy of his statement took a second to fully process. I stared at him, the icy forensic precision of my mind momentarily derailed by the sheer scale of his betrayal. That is impossible, I stated, my voice tight. You have absolutely no legal connection to my company. You do not have the authorization, the clearance, or the signatures required to bind my corporate assets to your failing manufacturing business. Howard laughed again, a harsh, triumphant sound. I am your father, Kelsey. I have your social security number. I have your original birth certificate. I kept digital copies of every single tax return you filed when you lived under my roof. I know your mother's maiden name and your childhood addresses. With a few strategic phone calls, a cleverly fabricated power of attorney, and a highly compensated notary public who knows how to look the other way, I successfully listed your entire company as the primary guarantor for my corporate tax liabilities. A wave of cold revulsion washed over me. He had not just made a bad business decision. He had actively engaged in calculated, premeditated identity theft. He had weaponized the basic biological facts of my existence to turn my life's work into a human shield for his crimes. Patricia, who had been watching this exchange, suddenly stood up straighter. A twisted, horrifying expression of relief washed over her face. She did not care that her husband had just admitted to a massive federal crime against her own daughter. She only registered that someone else was going to pay the bill. If Kelsey's company pays the taxes, we will not go to jail, Patricia whispered, frantically clutching Howard's arm. Howard, you saved us. I looked at my mother, feeling nothing but absolute disgust. You forged federal tax documents, I said, turning my attention back to Howard, allowing the severity of his actions to settle heavily into the room. You stole your own daughter's identity to cover up a Ponzi scheme. Family looks out for family, Howard mocked, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. You wanted to expose Jamal. You wanted to call the feds and burn my legacy to the ground. Well, congratulations, Kelsey. You got exactly what you wanted. But actions have consequences. The moment Jamal's fraud becomes public record, the IRS will move to instantly liquidate Preston Manufacturing. And when they find our corporate coffers completely empty, they are going to come directly for the guarantor. He took another step forward, his eyes burning with a scorched earth madness. He was a man willing to burn down the entire world as long as I burned with him. On Monday morning at exactly 8 a.m., the Internal Revenue Service will automatically freeze every single corporate account tied to your cybersecurity firm. Howard spat, detailing his trap with gleeful precision. They freeze first and ask questions later. They will seize your payroll. They will lock your operating funds. You will not be able to pay your employees or service your contracts. Your clients will flee. Your investors will panic. Your entire pristine little empire will be dismantled piece by piece to pay my debts. Liam shifted his weight, his jaw clenching as he processed the legal nightmare Howard had just unleashed. Untangling a fraudulent federal guarantor claim could take months or even years of brutal litigation. In the meantime, the IRS asset freeze would completely suffocate my company. Howard knew exactly how to inflict maximum operational damage. He knew how to strike where it would hurt the most. You thought you could destroy me and walk away? Howard growled, his face turning a mottled red as he pointed his phone at me like a weapon. You thought you could rise above us, but you are tied to this family whether you like it or not. You are going down with us, you little brat. Howard did not wait for my response. He lunged toward the head table, snatching up the crumpled piece of paper that had started this entire nightmare. It was the fraudulent $740,000 invoice for the fake wedding expenses. He marched back to me, his eyes burning with a manic, triumphant fire, and shoved the heavy cardstock directly into my chest. "I want it paid, Kelsey!" he hissed, jabbing his finger against the paper as I reflexively caught it. "I want the $740,000 transferred into my personal account by the end of this hour. But that is just the down payment." He leaned in so close I could smell the stale whiskey and panic on his breath. "You are going to pay the invoice, and then you are going to wire an additional $2 million as a formal settlement to Preston Manufacturing. 2.7 million total. You transfer the funds to bail out my company, and I will immediately sign the federal release forms to untangle your firm from my tax liabilities. I will call the IRS on Monday morning and lift the guarantor lock before they even freeze your payroll." He stepped back, throwing his arms out in a gesture of magnanimous victory. "It is a simple business transaction. You have the capital. We all know you have been hiding millions in your little corporate accounts while letting your own family struggle. Now you are going to pay your fair share. You buy your freedom, or you watch the federal government seize every single asset your cybersecurity firm possesses." The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air, a toxic cloud that seemed to suffocate the entire ballroom. He was not just asking for a bailout. He was executing a calculated, premeditated extortion scheme in front of witnesses. He had deliberately weaponized my identity to hold a gun to the head of my company, and now he was demanding a multi-million-dollar ransom to lower the weapon. "This was the plan all along, was it not?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "The wedding was just the stage. You never intended to pay a single caterer or florist. You fabricated that invoice knowing I would refuse to pay it just so you could manufacture a dispute. You needed a distraction while you quietly tied my corporate accounts to your sinking ship." Howard smirked, adjusting his cuffs with an air of arrogant superiority. "You always were too independent for your own good. I simply instituted a mandatory loyalty tax. You owe this family for your success. You used my name, my connections, and my pristine reputation to open doors in the corporate world. It is time you paid me back for the privilege of being a Preston." The twisted logic was staggering. I had built my company from the ground up, working 18-hour days, sleeping on a terrible mattress in a studio apartment, while he handed out trust funds to my sister. I had explicitly refused to use his name or his network precisely because I knew it would always come with a price tag. And yet, in his mind, my success was still somehow his property. Before I could tear his argument apart, a loud theatrical sob echoed across the floor. Patricia threw herself forward, collapsing onto her knees right in the center of the polished dance floor. The heavy silk of her designer gown pooled around her as she buried her face in her hands, letting out a series of ragged, dramatic gasps. It was a performance designed for maximum emotional manipulation, aimed directly at the few remaining country club executives and catering staff who had lingered by the doors. "Look at her!" Patricia wailed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me. "Look at my heartless daughter. She is rich. She has millions of dollars sitting in the bank while her own father faces utter ruin." She crawled forward a few inches, grabbing the edge of a linen tablecloth as if she were too weak to support her own weight. "We gave her everything," she cried out, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of a martyr. "We raised her in luxury. We gave her the best education money could buy. And now when her family is bleeding, when we are about to lose our home and our legacy, she stands there and refuses to help us." Patricia turned her tear-streaked face toward the bewildered onlookers. "She can save her own father," she pleaded, her voice cracking perfectly on cue. "She could write a check right now and end this nightmare. But she is too greedy. She is too selfish. Where is her family loyalty? How can a child be so completely devoid of human compassion?" The sheer toxicity of the scene was paralyzing. My mother was kneeling on the floor sobbing over a loss of wealth while completely ignoring the fact that her husband had just admitted to federal identity theft and criminal extortion. She did not care that Howard was holding my entire livelihood hostage. She only cared that I possessed the key to their salvation and was refusing to hand it over. Brittany, who had been watching from the sidelines, suddenly found her voice again. She rushed forward, standing over her mother and glaring at me with absolute hatred. "You are a monster, Kelsey," she shrieked. "Dad is just asking for a loan. You have the money. Just pay the stupid invoice and give him the settlement. If you let the bank take the Southampton estate, I will never forgive you. You are going to make us homeless just to prove a point." I looked at the three of them. My father the extortionist, my mother the theatrical martyr, my sister the entitled accomplice. They had formed a unified front of manipulation perfectly comfortable with destroying my life, as long as it preserved their comfort. They honestly believed that their shared delusion would force me to surrender. They thought the public pressure, the guilt, and the threat of corporate ruin would break my resolve. The silence stretched out heavy and suffocating. The remaining guests watched with bated breath, waiting to see if the cold, unfeeling daughter would finally crack under the weight of her family's desperate demands. Howard stood tall, crossing his arms over his chest, a smug, victorious smile plastered across his face. He was waiting for me to pull out my checkbook. He was waiting for me to surrender. I looked down at the fraudulent invoice he had shoved against my chest. The paper felt heavy, loaded with decades of emotional abuse and financial manipulation. I slowly smoothed out the creases, my expression completely unreadable. Liam stood silently at my shoulder, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of their manufactured chaos. He did not intervene. He knew exactly what was coming next. He knew that Howard had just made a fatal miscalculation. I held the invoice up, examining the inflated numbers and the forged signature at the bottom. It was a masterpiece of arrogance. $2.7 million, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, cutting through the remnants of Patricia's fake sobbing. "You want $2.7 million to release my company from a fraudulent guarantor trap that you illegally established." Howard nodded, his smile widening. "That is the price of doing business, Kelsey. Pay up, or watch your empire burn on Monday morning." I slowly lowered the invoice. I met his arrogant gaze and allowed a genuine, relaxed smile to spread across my face. The low murmurs of the remaining country club elite filled the ballroom. I could feel the heavy, judgmental stares of Howard's conservative peers burning into my back. These were people who operated on generational wealth and silent cover-ups. In their world, a daughter was supposed to quietly absorb the debts and sins of her father to protect the family name. They expected me to cave to the overwhelming pressure of familial duty. They expected me to fold the invoice, reach for a pen, and write the check that would make this ugly public spectacle disappear. Instead, I looked down at Patricia, who was still putting on her weeping theatrical performance on the polished floor. I let my eyes drift from her tear-stained face to Brittany's hateful glare, and finally back to Howard's smug, expectant grin. Family loyalty. I said, my voice perfectly flat, cutting through the whispers of the crowd. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Howard. Bailouts, settlements, family loyalty. Howard's grin twitched, but he held his ground. I repeated the words, letting them drop like heavy stones onto the ballroom floor. Family loyalty, bailouts, settlements. You demand family loyalty while stealing my identity. You demand bailouts while standing in a room paid for with stolen money. You demand settlements when you are executing a premeditated extortion scheme. Family loyalty, bailouts, settlements. The absolute sheer hypocrisy of those words coming from your mouth is staggering. The repetition hung in the air, a psychological hammer striking the same nail over and over again until the absurdity of their demands was impossible to ignore. Patricia's theatrical sobbing hitched. She looked up at me, her perfectly maintained mask of victimization cracking as she realized her performance was failing. The crowd's murmurs died down, replaced by an uncomfortable, chilling silence. The tension in the room grew so dense it felt hard to breathe. "You can talk in circles all you want," Kelsey Howard barked, trying to reclaim the upper hand. He jabbed a finger toward the invoice in my hand. "The IRS does not care about your little speeches. They care about the signature on that guarantor form. You are out of time." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply lifted my left wrist and calmly checked my watch. The gesture was so casual, so entirely devoid of the panic Howard expected that it threw him completely off balance. "It is exactly 8:45, I stated, tapping the glass face of my watch. "I am not out of time, Howard." "But you are." I looked up, meeting his eyes with a gaze so cold it made him take an involuntary half-step backward. "You really thought you could outsmart a data privacy expert with a forged guarantor signature?" I asked softly. Howard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight collar. The arrogant certainty in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden creeping doubt. "I have the notarized documents," he insisted, his voice losing a fraction of its booming volume. "The filing is already in the federal system." "It is in the system," I agreed, nodding slowly. "Because I let it go through." The color began to drain from Howard's face. Patricia scrambled to her feet, her heavy silk gown rustling loudly in the quiet room. Brittany grabbed her mother's arm, both of them staring at me with mounting horror. "Do you have any idea what my company actually does?" Howard, I asked, taking another step forward, forcing him to retreat. "We build impenetrable digital fortresses for international banks. We design threat detection algorithms for the Department of Defense. We monitor the dark web for stolen corporate credentials. My entire life's work is dedicated to hunting down people who steal digital identities." "And you honestly believed you could hijack my company's employer identification number, fabricate a power of attorney, and submit it to the Internal Revenue Service without triggering a single alarm?" Howard's breathing grew shallow. He looked toward the exit, but Liam smoothly shifted his stance, blocking the aisle. "The moment your highly compensated corrupt notary stamped that fraudulent document, a red flag went off in my firm's automated compliance system," I explained, delivering the truth with surgical precision. "I knew exactly what you were trying to do 3 weeks ago." My legal team immediately contacted the IRS Cybercrimes Division. "We did not block the filing, Howard. We flagged it. We flagged it, and we waited." "You are lying." Howard choked out, panic finally saturating his voice. "If the IRS knew it was fake, they would have rejected the filing." "They accepted the filing to establish the paper trail," I countered, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "Every time you logged into the federal portal to check the status of your fraudulent guarantor claim, you fed the authorities another clean, verifiable IP address. You handed them a complete, digitally authenticated record of your extortion attempt. They did not freeze my accounts, Howard. They put a federal trap and trace on yours." The reality of his situation crashed down on him. The trap he thought he had so brilliantly set for me had actually been a cage he was happily locking himself inside. He had handed the federal government undeniable proof of corporate fraud, identity theft, and extortion, all tied up with a neat digital bow. "You set me up." Howard breathed, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of cracks. "You set yourself up?" "Howard," I replied, my tone completely devoid of pity. "I just let you finish the job." Before Howard could form another word, a sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the ballroom. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance, the shrill rising and falling note of police sirens. Not the federal agents who had quietly arrived in unmarked black SUVs to arrest Jamal. These were local police cruisers and federal marshals coming in loud and fast. The wailing grew louder, tearing through the quiet Southampton night. The sound multiplied, echoing off the expensive waterfront properties as multiple vehicles sped down the long, winding driveway of the estate. Patricia let out a sharp, terrified gasp, backing away from the windows. Brittany covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with sheer terror. The sirens grew deafeningly loud. Red and blue emergency lights began to flash violently through the tall ballroom windows, casting chaotic, spinning shadows across the crystal chandeliers and the terrified faces of the remaining guests. The cavalry had arrived, and they were not coming for Jamal. They were coming for the architect of the entire corrupt empire. The heavy oak double doors of the ballroom burst open with a deafening crack that silenced the remaining murmurs of the crowd. 4 federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI marched into the venue. They were immediately flanked by two stern-faced officers from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The sheer authority radiating from the squad sent a physical shockwave through the room. The wealthy elite of Southampton, the country club board members, the society gossips, and the catering staff all scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the walls. The crowd literally parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path straight down the center of the dance floor. Howard did not shrink back. He did not cower. The blinding red and blue strobes illuminating the ballroom seemed to ignite a final desperate surge of absolute delusion in his mind. He looked at the federal agent striding toward our side of the room, and his face lit up with a manic, terrifying triumph. His brain had completely rejected my explanation of the digital trap. He fully believed his forged IRS documents had triggered a federal raid on my company and that these agents were here to execute the asset freeze in person. He lunged forward, stabbing his finger through the air, pointing directly at my chest. "Arrest her!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with absolute arrogant certainty. "She is the one you want. She is the primary guarantor of the fraudulent accounts. She holds the collateral for Preston Manufacturing. She is the mastermind behind the missing funds. I am cooperating with the investigation, and I am handing her to you right now." Patricia and Brittany watched this unfold with breathless anticipation. For a split second, they actually looked relieved. They clutched each other's hands, believing that Howard had magically orchestrated a last-minute reversal of fortune. They thought the nightmare was ending. They thought I was going to be led away in handcuffs, taking the blame for their financial ruin while they walked away untouched to enjoy their stolen wealth. The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped gray beard, did not even break his stride. He did not look at me. He did not look at Liam. He marched directly past Howard's outstretched pointing finger and stepped squarely into Howard's personal space. "Howard Preston." The agent asked, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that carried absolute finality. "Yes," Howard answered, puffing out his chest, trying to project the aura of a helpful corporate titan. "I am the CEO. I can provide you with all the digital signatures proving her firm is liable for the missing capital. I have the power of attorney right here on my device. I can show you exactly how she orchestrated this entire mess to ruin my company." "You have the right to remain silent," the agent stated smoothly, reaching to his belt and producing a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Howard froze. His triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a look of profound, jarring confusion. "What are you doing?" he stammered, taking a clumsy step backward, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the slick floor. "You are making a mistake. I am the informant. She is the guarantor. She is the one committing tax fraud. Look at the documents. I have the IRS notices." "We have looked at the documents," Mr. Preston, the lead IRS investigator, chimed in, stepping up beside the FBI agent. "Specifically, we looked at the IP addresses, the timestamp logs, and the digital notary seals attached to the power of attorney you submitted to our federal portal. We also reviewed the audio recording of the extortion attempt you just conducted in this room, which was simultaneously broadcast to our field office via Ms. Preston's security detail." I glanced sideways at Liam. He gave a microscopic, subtle nod. The entire time Howard had been ranting about his trap, shoving the fraudulent invoice into my chest, and demanding a $2 million settlement, Liam had been transmitting the audio. He had triggered a live feed the moment Howard pulled out his phone and started making demands. Howard had not just confessed to identity theft and extortion in front of a ballroom of witnesses. He had confessed directly to the federal agents waiting at the end of the driveway. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the FBI agent commanded, grabbing Howard's shoulder and spinning him around with practiced, ruthless efficiency. "Howard Preston, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate tax evasion, criminal identity theft, and the attempted extortion of a federal witness." "No," Howard shrieked, his voice pitching upward into a hysterical panic as the cold steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a heavy metallic click. "No, this is a mistake. Kelsey, tell them. Tell them you agreed to the settlement. Tell them it was a corporate loan. Tell them I am your father." Patricia let out a blood-curdling scream. She tried to rush forward, but an agent held up a warning hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. Howard. She wailed, her hands flying to her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup in an instant. Howard, do something. Call your lawyers. Call the judge. You promised me this was fixed. You promised me we were safe. What about the house? Brittany was hyperventilating, backing away from her father as if he were carrying a contagious disease. She looked at the handcuffs and then looked down at her own expensive dress, realizing in real time that every single piece of silk and diamonds she wore had been bought with stolen money. "Dad, what did you do?" she sobbed, her voice trembling with purely selfish terror. "What is going to happen to us? Who is going to pay my rent? Who is going to pay for my life?" Howard ignored them completely. He was twisting his torso, struggling against the grip of the federal agents, his eyes wide and wild as he stared at me. "You set me up," he snarled, spit flying from his lips, his face turning a mottled, violent shade of purple. "You orchestrated this entire night. You bought my debt. You trapped Jamal. You handed my files to the feds. You planned every single second of this to destroy me." I took one calm step forward, standing just inches from his sweating red face. I looked at the man who had tormented me, dismissed me, and tried to ruin me for my entire life. "You destroyed yourself, Howard," I said, my voice perfectly steady, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. "You built a legacy on greed, manipulation, and fraud. You thought you could use everyone around you as collateral damage, including your own daughter. I did not force you to steal. I did not force you to forge those documents. I did not force you to try and extort me. I simply stopped letting you get away with it. You wanted to play a game of corporate warfare. You just did not realize you were playing against someone who actually knew the rules." The agents jerked him forward, forcing him to walk toward the exit. Howard dug his heels into the polished floor, trying desperately to maintain one last shred of his dignity in front of the stunned country club guests. "Do not look at me like that," he screamed at the crowd, his polished veneer completely stripped away, revealing the pathetic, desperate criminal underneath. "I am Howard Preston. I built this town. You all owe me respect." No one answered him. The silence of his peers was absolute. The very people he had tried so hard to impress, the people he had stolen millions to keep up with, simply turned their heads away in disgust. The agents marched him out through the heavy oak doors, the flashing red and blue lights catching the reflection of the steel handcuffs as he disappeared into the night. The architect of the Preston family nightmare was finally gone, leaving behind nothing but the ashes of his own greed. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open with a deafening crack that shattered the remaining tension in the room. 4 federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI marched into the venue. They were immediately flanked by 2 stern-faced officers from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The sheer authority radiating from the squad sent a physical shockwave through the room. The wealthy elite of Southampton, the country club board members, the society gossips, and the catering staff all scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the walls. The crowd literally parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path straight down the center of the dance floor. Howard did not shrink back. He did not cower. The blinding red and blue strobes illuminating the ballroom from the driveway seemed to ignite a final desperate surge of absolute delusion in his mind. He looked at the federal agents striding toward our side of the room, and his face lit up with a manic, terrifying triumph. His brain had completely rejected my explanation of the digital trap. He fully believed his forged documents had triggered a federal raid on my company, and that these agents were here to execute the asset freeze in person. He lunged forward, stabbing his finger through the air, pointing directly at my chest. "Arrest her!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with absolute arrogant certainty. "She is the one you want. She is the primary guarantor of the fraudulent accounts. She holds the collateral for Preston Manufacturing. She is the mastermind behind the missing funds. I am cooperating with the investigation, and I am handing her to you right now." Patricia and Brittany watched this unfold with breathless anticipation. For a split second, they actually looked relieved. They clutched each other's hands, believing that Howard had magically orchestrated a last-minute reversal of fortune. They thought the nightmare was ending. They thought I was going to be led away in handcuffs, taking the blame for their financial ruin, while they walked away untouched to enjoy their stolen wealth. The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped gray beard, did not even break his stride. He did not look at me. He did not look at Liam. He marched directly past Howard's outstretched pointing finger, completely ignoring the frantic CEO. The agent's eyes were locked onto a completely different target. He walked straight past me and made a direct beeline for Jamal. Jamal had been trying to silently edge his way toward the side exit while Howard was causing a distraction. He realized instantly that the agents were not here for a corporate tax dispute. They were here for the missing millions. Jamal turned to run, but he did not make it past the first cocktail table. The lead FBI agent lunged forward, grabbing Jamal by the collar of his expensive tailored suit. With a swift, brutal motion, the agent spun Jamal around and slammed him face first onto a nearby catering table. Crystal champagne flutes and silver platters shattered and scattered across the floor in a chaotic crash. Jamal let out a sharp cry of pain as his cheek was pressed hard against the white linen. "Jamal Blackwood, you are under arrest," the agent barked, hauling Jamal's arms behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs slapped onto his wrists with a sharp metallic click. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud and the operation of an illegal Ponzi scheme. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Brittany let out a blood-curdling scream of absolute horror. The illusion of her perfect wealthy life evaporated in a single violent instant. She watched the man who was supposed to fund her lavish lifestyle get pinned to a table by federal authorities. "Jamal," she shrieked, lunging forward, her hands outstretched as if she could somehow physically pull him away from the FBI. "What are you doing? Let him go. He is an investment banker. You are making a mistake." Two other agents quickly stepped in front of Brittany, blocking her path and forcing her back. "Ma'am, you need to step away," an agent warned, his hand resting firmly on his utility belt. Brittany collapsed against Patricia, both women sobbing hysterically as they watched Jamal get hauled to his feet. His designer suit was wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne, his arrogant Wall Street persona completely destroyed. Howard stood frozen, his arms still half raised, pointing at me. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His brain was short-circuiting, unable to process why the FBI was arresting his son-in-law instead of the daughter he had tried to frame. "Wait," Howard finally stammered, his voice pitching upward in panic. "No, you are looking at the wrong person. The missing funds are tied to her corporate accounts. Look at the paperwork. I have the guarantor documents right here on my phone. She signed them. She is liable for the debt." He frantically tapped the cracked screen of his smartphone, waving it toward the agents. "You need to arrest Kelsey. She is the one responsible for the tax liabilities." One of the IRS criminal investigation officers, a woman with cold, calculating eyes and a demeanor carved from ice, slowly turned to face Howard. She did not look at the phone he was frantically waving. "We have already seen the paperwork, Mr. Preston," the IRS agent stated, her voice cutting through the hysterical sobbing of Patricia and Brittany. "We saw it the exact moment your notary submitted it to the federal portal. We also saw the IP address, the timestamp, and the digital fingerprint attached to the submission." Howard swallowed hard, his hand slowly lowering. "But it proves she is the guarantor," he insisted, his voice trembling. "It proves she is liable." "It proves absolutely nothing regarding Kelsey Preston," the agent replied coldly, stepping into Howard's personal space. "My division has been investigating Preston Manufacturing for 6 months. We have been tracking the offshore transfers, the fabricated profit margins, and the deliberate falsification of your corporate tax returns. We already knew your company was bankrupt, Mr. Preston. We were simply waiting for you to make a definitive move." The agent gestured toward the cracked phone in Howard's hand. "The forged guarantor document you submitted tonight does not implicate your daughter. It only provides the federal government with undeniable written proof of your explicit intent to commit federal tax evasion and criminal identity theft. You documented your own crime." Howard's face drained of all color. The arrogant certainty that had defined his entire existence shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The trap he thought he had laid for me had been a meticulously constructed cage for himself, and he had willingly locked the door. Howard Preston, the IRS agent, continued, her voice completely devoid of emotion, as she reached to her belt. You are under arrest for federal tax fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. She grabbed his wrist, twisting his arm behind his back. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked onto Howard's wrists, mirroring the same sharp sound that had just sealed Jamal's fate. The man who had spent his entire life manipulating the law and extorting his own family was finally rendered completely powerless, staring at the ruins of his empire. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around Howard's wrists echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous ballroom. For a man who had spent his entire life dictating the terms of every room he entered, the reality of being physically restrained by federal authorities was completely incomprehensible. His shoulders slumped, and the manic energy that had fueled his extortion attempt evaporated, leaving him looking small, hollow, and utterly defeated. Before Howard could even attempt to formulate a pathetic plea for leniency, Liam stepped forward. My husband moved with the calm, calculated precision of a predator who had just watched the trap snap shut perfectly on its prey. The federal agents instinctively turned their attention toward him, recognizing the shift in authority. Liam did not look at Patricia, who was still sobbing on the floor, or Brittany, who was staring vacantly at Jamal's arrested form. His focus was entirely on the lead FBI agent and the IRS criminal investigation officer. Officers, I believe I have some additional materials that will streamline your prosecution, Liam said, his voice carrying the smooth, resonant cadence of a high-powered attorney accustomed to dismantling hostile witnesses. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and slowly withdrew a sleek silver audio recorder. The device caught the flashing emergency lights from outside, highlighting the solid red recording indicator that was still glowing steadily. I am Liam Thorne, acting as primary legal counsel for my wife, Kelsey. Liam continued, holding the device up for the agents to see. What you have just walked into is the culmination of a meticulously documented financial crime. For the past 20 minutes, I have been capturing a clear, uncoerced, high-definition audio recording of Howard Preston attempting to extort my wife. Howard's head snapped up, his eyes widening in pure horror as he stared at the small silver device in Liam's hand. You recorded me, he gasped, his voice cracking. You cannot do that. That is illegal. That is a private conversation. New York is a two-party consent state when it comes to recording conversations, Howard Liam replied without missing a beat, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. But we are currently standing in the state of Connecticut, which operates under a one-party consent law. I am a party to this conversation, and I consented to record it. Every single threat you made tonight is perfectly admissible in federal court. Liam gestured downward toward the polished hardwood floor. Lying just a few feet away, completely ignored in the chaos of the raid, was the crumpled, heavy cardstock invoice Howard had aggressively shoved into my chest earlier. That piece of paper on the floor is a fabricated invoice for $740,000, Liam instructed the IRS agent, pointing clearly at the evidence. Howard presented it to my wife tonight as a manufactured debt. However, as you will hear on this recording, the fake catering bill was merely the opening gambit. Mr. Preston explicitly demanded a wire transfer of $2.7 million to his personal accounts. He stated clearly on the audio that if Kelsey did not pay this ransom, he would weaponize his fraudulently obtained guarantor status to allow the federal government to seize her cybersecurity firm. The IRS agent raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by the sheer volume of self-incriminating evidence Howard had managed to generate in a single evening. She signaled to a junior agent who immediately stepped forward, wearing latex gloves, to carefully collect the crumpled invoice and place it into a clear plastic evidence bag. You trapped me! Howard choked out, pulling uselessly against the heavy steel cuffs, binding his hands behind his back. He looked between Liam and me, his face twisting with a mixture of hatred and absolute panic. This is textbook entrapment. You baited me into this room just to set me up. No judge will allow this. Liam let out a short, humorless laugh. Entrapment requires law enforcement to coerce a citizen into committing a crime they otherwise would not have committed. We did not coerce you, Howard. We simply sent you a wedding invitation. You are the one who proactively chose to forge a power of attorney. You are the one who illegally bound my wife's company to your failing tax liabilities. And you are the one who marched into this ballroom and demanded nearly $3 million to undo your own fraudulent actions. All we did was give you a microphone and a long enough rope to hang yourself. The sheer, airtight finality of Liam's legal assessment hung heavily in the air. Howard realized with sickening clarity that there was no loophole. There was no expensive legal maneuver that could untangle him from this mess. He had walked willingly into a slaughterhouse believing he was the butcher. Liam handed the sleek audio recorder to the lead FBI agent, who sealed it inside a secondary evidence bag. The trap Howard thought he had brilliantly executed against me was actually our trap for him all along. We had anticipated his greed, predicted his arrogance, and systematically removed every single exit. The evidence against him was now bundled into a neat, undeniable package ready to be handed directly to the federal prosecutors. "Take them out," the lead FBI agent ordered, nodding toward Howard and Jamal. The agents grabbed Howard by his upper arms, marching him roughly toward the grand oak doors. The man who had spent decades demanding respect and obedience from his family was now being paraded out of his own lavish country club reception, a disgraced criminal bound for a federal holding cell. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the federal agents, severing Howard and Jamal from the lavish world they had so desperately tried to steal. The sharp metallic click of the latch echoed through the silent ballroom. The flashing red and blue emergency lights faded as the convoy of unmarked SUVs tore down the long, winding driveway, carrying the two men toward federal holding cells. Patricia stared at the closed doors, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her panic-stricken lungs. The reality of her husband being hauled away in handcuffs finally breached the thick walls of her denial. She snapped out of her shock and scrambled across the polished dance floor, crawling on her hands and knees. Her heavy silk designer gown dragged uselessly behind her as she threw herself at my feet, reaching out with shaking manicured hands to grab the fabric of my dress. "Kelsey, you have to stop them!" she wailed, her voice a jagged, hysterical shriek that pierced the quiet room. "You have to call them back right now. Tell them it is a massive misunderstanding. Tell them Howard just made a simple mistake with the corporate paperwork. You have the power to fix this. We are your family, Kelsey. We are your blood. You cannot let them take your father away like a common criminal. He will not survive in federal prison. You have to save him." Brittany stumbled forward, her own face streaked with ruined mascara and sweat. She fell to her knees beside her mother, entirely stripped of her usual arrogant superiority. "Kelsey, please," she sobbed, her hands trembling as she clutched her diamond necklace. "Jamal is gone. Dad is gone. The federal agents are going to freeze all the bank accounts by morning. I have nothing left. We will lose the Southampton house. How am I supposed to pay for my penthouse? What about my credit cards? You have all that money in your company. Just pay the fines and tell the FBI you authorized the transfer. You can make this go away. You owe us. Dad gave you the very name that made you successful." I looked down at the two women weeping at my feet. For 35 years I had craved their affection. I had worked myself into the ground trying to earn a single word of genuine praise from the mother who was currently begging me to commit federal perjury. I had spent my entire youth making myself small so my sister could shine. I had absorbed their constant criticism, their financial manipulation, and their endless demands. But standing there looking at their tear-stained, terrified faces, I felt absolutely nothing. The well of my empathy was completely dry. Liam stepped forward, his jaw tight, ready to physically remove Patricia from my personal space. I raised my hand, signaling him to wait. I did not need protection from them anymore. They had no power left to wield. I slowly bent down and picked up the heavy cardstock paper lying on the floor. It was the fraudulent $740,000 invoice for the fake wedding expenses. The exact piece of paper Howard had used to initiate his extortion scheme. The paper felt heavy loaded with decades of lies and toxic entitlement. I smoothed out the creases in the paper and walked over to the nearest linen-draped catering table. A large decorative pillar candle burned brightly in the center of an elaborate floral arrangement, casting a warm, flickering glow. Patricia and Brittany watched me with wide, desperate eyes, tracking my every movement, as if I were about to perform a miracle that would restore their stolen wealth. "You still do not understand what just happened, do you?" I asked, my voice eerily calm, carrying clearly across the silent room. "You are still operating under the absolute delusion that I exist solely to absorb your collateral damage. You stood in this exact spot 10 minutes ago and watched your husband try to steal $3 million from my company. You cheered him on. You demanded I pay the ransom. You called me a monster for refusing to bail out a man who actively forged my signature to save his own skin. And now that he has been caught, you dare to use the word family to manipulate me into saving him." I held the edge of the thick cardstock invoice directly over the open flame of the candle. The paper caught instantly, the fire blooming bright orange and yellow as it eagerly consumed the fraudulent numbers and the forged signature. Patricia gasped, shrinking back as the flames grew rapidly. I held the burning paper for a few seconds, watching the fire eat away the lies, before dropping it onto a large silver serving tray on the table. We all watched in total silence as the heavy cardstock curled and blackened, the smoke rising toward the vaulted ceiling. The fire reduced Howard's grand extortion scheme to a pile of gray, fragile ashes. "Blood did not protect me from your theft, Mother," I said, staring directly into Patricia's terrified eyes. "Family did not stop you from allowing Howard to treat my livelihood as his personal bank account. You only invoke loyalty when you are the ones who desperately need saving. But the vault is permanently closed. The debt is paid. My obligations to this family burned up the moment Howard decided my destruction was the acceptable price of his survival. We are officially strangers." Patricia let out a wounded, broken wail, burying her face in her hands. Brittany simply stared at the ashes on the silver tray, her mouth hanging open in silent, paralyzing shock. I turned away from them and looked toward the perimeter of the ballroom. The country club's private security detail had been standing by the doors, watching the federal raid unfold in stunned silence. "Gentlemen," I called out, my voice projecting absolute calm authority. "These two women are no longer welcome on this property. They are trespassing at a private event. Please escort them to the exit immediately. If they refuse to leave quietly, you have my permission to call the local police and have them removed for disturbing the peace." The security guards did not hesitate. They marched forward, grabbing Patricia and Brittany firmly by the arms and hauling them to their feet. Patricia thrashed and screamed, crying out my name, begging me to reconsider as they dragged her across the polished floor. Brittany stumbled along beside her, completely numb, her eyes vacant as the reality of her total ruin finally took hold. The heavy oak doors opened one last time, and the security guards pushed them out into the cold night air. The doors clicked shut, cutting off Patricia's hysterical wailing for good. The ballroom was completely silent, save for the soft, classical music still playing faintly through the venue's sound system. The country club elite, the catering staff, and the remaining guests all stared at me in absolute awe. I had just dismantled one of the most powerful, corrupt families in Southampton without raising my voice or losing my composure. I turned to Liam, who was watching me with a look of profound pride and unwavering support. He offered me his arm. I slipped my hand through his, and we walked slowly toward the exit, moving past the tables and the whispering crowd. The air in the room felt remarkably clean and light. For the first time in 35 years, I was not carrying the suffocating weight of the Preston family name. I had burned their invoice. I had burned their legacy. I had burned the bridges that kept me tied to their toxicity. And as I stepped out into the crisp night air, leaving the ashes behind, I knew I was finally, completely, and undeniably free. But before Liam and I could descend the stone steps of the terrace, a sudden sound rippled through the grand ballroom behind us. It started as a single pair of hands clapping near the front. Then another joined in. Then a dozen more. I turned around, looking back through the open oak doors. The remaining guests, the ones who had not been defrauded by Jamal, the ones who had silently endured Howard's arrogant bullying for decades, were on their feet. The polite murmurs of country club society vanished, replaced by a spontaneous, thunderous wave of genuine applause. They were clapping for me. They were clapping for the dismantling of a corrupt empire. They were clapping for the end of Howard Preston's reign. The sound was deafening, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and washing over me in a warm, cathartic wave. Liam squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with pride. "You earned this," he murmured, leaning close to my ear. "Every single second of it." I looked at the silver tray where the ashes of the fraudulent invoice still smoked. I looked at the empty space where my father had stood in handcuffs. I was not going to leave. I was not going to slip away into the night like a victim escaping a crime scene. This was my victory. This was my stage now. I turned away from the cold night air and walked back into the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me again, but this time not out of shock or fear. They parted out of absolute respect. I walked straight up to the raised dais, where the jazz band was standing frozen, unsure of what to do after the federal raid. "Play something upbeat," I instructed the bandleader, my voice clear and ringing with joy. "Play something alive." The bandleader grinned, raising his trumpet. The upright bass kicked in with a heavy, swinging rhythm, followed instantly by the bright, sharp brass of a lively jazz standard. The somber, tense atmosphere of the room shattered completely. I turned to Liam, grabbing his lapels and pulling him right into the center of the polished dance floor. We moved together, the heavy silk of my dress spinning around my ankles. I threw my head back and laughed, a real deep, unfiltered laugh that carried years of release. We danced under the crystal chandeliers, claiming the space, claiming the night, claiming our future. The shadows of the Preston family were gone. The ballroom was alive. I was alive. 1 year later. The sprawling Southampton estate with its ocean views and manicured lawns was gone. It had been seized by federal marshals and auctioned off to pay restitution to the countless victims of Howard and Jamal's financial crimes. Howard Preston, the man who believed he was untouchable, the man who demanded absolute loyalty, was currently residing in a federal penitentiary in upstate New York. He wore a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit, his tailored suits replaced by rough cotton. His daily routine was dictated by guards who did not care about his name, his lineage, or his former country club memberships. Jamal occupied a similar cell in a different facility, serving a 20-year sentence for wire fraud. His smooth-talking charm was entirely useless behind reinforced steel bars. They had nothing. They were nothing. Patricia and Brittany were also serving a sentence, though theirs lacked the steel bars. Their reality was a cramped, low-income apartment on the outskirts of the city. The designer gowns and diamond necklaces had been seized to settle the massive debts Howard left behind. The endless flow of corporate money had completely evaporated. Now Patricia woke up every morning at 5 and put on a stiff polyester uniform to serve coffee at a local diner. Her manicured hands were red and chapped from washing industrial dishes. Brittany stood behind the cash register of a discount grocery store, scanning barcodes for minimum wage. Her arrogant superiority had been ground down into bitter, exhausting reality. They rode the bus, they counted coupons, they lived in constant, suffocating panic. There were no bailouts for them. There were no settlements. There was no family loyalty. They had demanded my destruction to fund their luxury, and now they were drowning in the very poverty they had mocked my entire life. They tried to reach out to me in the beginning. They left desperate voicemails and sent pleading letters begging for financial assistance. I never answered a single one. The vault was closed. We were officially strangers. While their world collapsed into dust, my world expanded into a global empire. I stood in the center of my new penthouse office, located on the top floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper in Manhattan. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city skyline stretching out beneath me like a sprawling electric grid. My cybersecurity firm had quadrupled in size over the past 12 months. The high-profile takedown of Howard's extortion ring and Jamal's Ponzi scheme had inadvertently served as the greatest marketing campaign in the history of the industry. International banks, federal agencies, and global tech conglomerates were practically breaking down our doors begging for our digital protection services. We were expanding into Europe and Asia, opening new offices in London and Tokyo. I was no longer just the workaholic daughter hiding in a studio apartment. I was the CEO of an international fortress. The office door opened and Liam walked in carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He wore a sharp, tailored suit, his tie loosened just enough to show he was perfectly at ease. He handed me a cup and stood beside me, looking out over the city. "The Tokyo contracts are finalized," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "They agreed to every single one of your terms. No pushback, no negotiations. They know you hold all the cards." I smiled, taking a slow, warm sip. I looked down at the bustling streets below, watching the thousands of cars moving like tiny veins of light through the city. I felt the solid, reassuring weight of Liam's presence beside me. I felt the immense, quiet power of the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. I had survived the gaslighting. I had survived the theft. I had survived the ultimate betrayal. I did not just survive it. I weaponized it. I turned their greed into the exact instrument of their destruction. I turned away from the window and walked over to my massive obsidian desk. There were no fraudulent invoices lying there. There were no demands for unearned loyalty. There was only the future. "I am ready," I said, setting my coffee down. "Let us build the next fortress." The ghosts of my past were locked away in concrete cells in cramped apartments. They were chained to their consequences. But I was standing at the absolute peak of my world, completely unburdened, completely powerful, and finally entirely free. The profound lesson here is that blood does not automatically equal family. Toxic relatives often weaponize the concept of loyalty only when they need to be saved from their own destructive choices. True strength lies in recognizing your own worth and having the courage to establish ironclad boundaries, even if it means walking away from the people who raised you. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep your abusers warm. Ultimate freedom comes when you stop seeking validation from those incapable of giving it, and instead channel that energy into building your own independent, magnificent life. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace? Share your story of resilience in the comments below. If Kelsey's journey to ultimate freedom resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with anyone who needs a powerful reminder that their worth is never defined by the people who failed to value them.